The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century did not signal the end of the Roman world, even though the old order of emperors in Rome had passed into history. What persisted in the Eastern Mediterranean was a state that still considered itself the Roman Empire, even as its power, culture, and priorities began to change in ways that would distinguish it from its vanished Western counterpart. Centred in Constantinople, a city originally founded as Byzantium and transformed by Constantine the Great into a second Rome, this realm carried forward the imperial idea with unbroken succession. To the people who lived within its walls and provinces, there was no question that they were Romans. They called their empire the Basileia ton Romaion, the empire of the Romans, and their ruler was Basilius, the Roman emperor. What outsiders later called Byzantium was for them a continuation of the Roman Imperium, adapted to new realities, but bound to ancient legitimacy. The geography of this surviving empire shaped its destiny. The western half of Rome had been sprawling, overstretched, and battered by waves of migrations and invasions it could not contain. The east, by contrast, was more compact, concentrated around the prosperous eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the vital provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. The economy of this region remained strong even as the west declined. Grain from Egypt still fed cities, trade routes carried spices, silks, and precious goods from as far as India and China, and Constantinople sat astride both land and sea routes that connected Europe to Asia. The eastern provinces had been less exposed to the Germanic incursions that overwhelmed Italy, Gaul, and Spain, and so their urban and administrative structures held together. The result was that when the imperial court in the west fell into the hands of barbarian kings, the empire that remained in the east could still marshal resources, armies, and a functioning bureaucracy. The survival of imperial institutions gave the Eastern Empire a sense of unbroken legitimacy. Emperors still sat on a throne, issued laws and minted coins with their profiles. The Senate, though diminished in importance, still gathered. Imperial titles, ceremonies, and symbols were preserved, anchoring authority in traditions that stretched back to Augustus. Even as the practical realities of power shifted eastward, the forms of Roman governance gave continuity. This continuity was vital, for it convinced subjects and foreign powers alike that the empire endured. To call oneself Roman in Constantinople was not a fiction, but a claim backed by legal structures, armies, and the memory of centuries. The cultural life of the Eastern Empire reflected both its Roman inheritance and its Greek heart. Latin had long been the official language of administration, the idiom of law and the army, but in daily life, especially in the East, Greek was the tongue of the people. Philosophical traditions, literary forms, and educational systems in Greek shaped elite culture, and over time Greek would eclipse Latin as the language of governance. This shift did not happen instantly, but emerged gradually, as the Eastern Empire leaned into the cultural patterns of its Greek-speaking provinces. Christianity also grew to be a defining element of identity. By the time the West fell, the empire had already embraced Christianity as its official religion. The Eastern Empire became the guardian of the faith, shaping theology, supporting councils, and weaving Christian ideals into the fabric of imperial ideology. To be Roman was to be Christian, and the emperor was seen as God's vicegerent on earth, responsible for protecting orthodoxy and guiding the church. The fall of the West in 476, marked by the deposition of the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, resonated in Constantinople, but it did not undermine the Eastern throne. The Eastern emperor of that moment, Zeno, regarded Odoacer not as a peer but as a subordinate, a patrician ruling Italy in the name of the emperor. In practice, Odoacer was independent, but the fiction of Roman unity endured. Even after the West had passed into the hands of Gothic kings, emperors in Constantinople continued to claim universal authority. This assertion of sovereignty over lands they no longer controlled reveals the enduring belief that there could only be one empire. Fragmentation was never fully accepted, even as the practical borders of control contracted. The court at Constantinople became the centre of the Roman world. The city itself embodied imperial survival. Founded on the site of the old Greek colony of Byzantium, Constantine had transformed it into a capital that rivaled Rome itself. Its strategic position on the Bosporus gave control of maritime routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Its walls, formidable and carefully maintained, shielded it from invaders. Its palaces, churches, and hippodrome projected imperial grandeur. By the late 5th century, Constantinople had grown into a metropolis with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, a hub of commerce, culture, and political intrigue. The emperor's presence gave the city a sacral aura, as if it were not merely a seat of power, but the heart of a Christian empire protected by divine providence. The society that endured within this empire was deeply hierarchical, structured by rank and office, but bound together by shared identity as Romans. Aristocratic families, many of them rooted in old senatorial lineages, continued to wield influence. The bureaucracy, staffed by educated officials, carried out the complex work of taxation, military provisioning, and legal adjudication. The army, though increasingly reliant on mercenaries and federate troops, remained the backbone of defence. Peasants, artisans, and merchants made up the bulk of the population, sustaining the empire through agriculture and trade. Slavery persisted, though on a reduced scale compared to earlier centuries, while serfdom began to shape rural labour arrangements. Religion penetrated every layer of society, with bishops and monks guiding communities, founding monasteries, and serving as moral authorities alongside imperial officials. The persistence of the empire was not without strain. The 5th and 6th centuries brought both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, the Eastern emperors inherited a state that still possessed wealth and order, giving them a platform from which to project power. On the other hand, threats pressed on every frontier. To the north, Slavic tribes and steppe nomads eyed the Balkans. To the east, the Sasanian Persians remained formidable rivals. In the Mediterranean, the rise of Germanic kingdoms created new powers that could contest imperial claims in Italy, North Africa, and Spain. The emperors of Constantinople had to navigate a world in flux, balancing the legacy of universal empire with the realities of diminished control. The reign of Justinian in the 6th century exemplified the ambitions and contradictions of this era. Ascending the throne in 527, Justinian sought not only to preserve but to expand, dreaming of restoring Roman rule over the West. His campaigns, led by generals like Belisarius, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain. For a moment it seemed that the Mediterranean had been reunited under Roman authority, but these victories came at immense cost, draining resources and exposing the empire to renewed dangers. Even as Justinian celebrated triumphs, his realm faced plague, economic strain, and constant war. His reign demonstrated both the heights the Eastern Empire could reach and the vulnerabilities it carried within. The continuity of Roman law became another pillar of survival. Justinian ordered the compilation of centuries of legal tradition into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental codification that preserved Roman jurisprudence for generations. This legal heritage outlasted even the empire itself, shaping medieval and modern European law. The effort revealed the empire's self-perception. It was still Rome, custodian of an ancient order, even as it adapted to new circumstances. Law, theology, and military might combine to sustain the imperial vision. Despite triumphs, challenges multiplied. The plague of Justinian in the mid-6th century devastated populations, undermining the economic base of cities and countryside alike. Waves of disease spread along trade routes, killing perhaps half the empire's inhabitants. The demographic collapse weakened armies and tax revenues, leaving the empire vulnerable. At the same time, constant wars against Persians and other enemies sapped strength. The empire endured, but the costs of ambition revealed limits. From this point forward, survival often required adaptation rather than conquest. religion remained both a source of unity and of division. As the empire defined itself as Christian, theological disputes roiled its society. Debates over Christ's nature, councils convened to define orthodoxy, and imperial interventions in doctrine marked Byzantine life. These disputes were not mere abstractions, but matters that could spark riots, split communities, and determine political fortunes. The role of the emperor as protector of orthodoxy gave him immense authority, but also bound him to controversies that could destabilize his reign. The relationship between church and state became a defining feature of Byzantine history, one that would shape centuries of conflict and creativity. The early centuries of the Eastern Empire demonstrate resilience. Though the western half of Rome had fallen, the East endured through wealth, administration, military power, and a sense of destiny. Constantinople's walls stood firm. Its officials kept records, its generals fought campaigns, and its emperors presented themselves as heirs to Augustus and Constantine. From this foundation, the Byzantine world would continue to evolve, facing new enemies, new crises, and new transformations that would carry it through 1,000 years of history, adjusting to the challenges of Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders alike, while always holding to the claim that Rome lived on at the Bosporus. The city that became the heart of the Byzantine Empire began as an unremarkable Greek colony on the European side of the Bosporus. Founded by settlers from Megara in the 7th century BCE, it bore the name Byzantion, or Byzantium. Its location, though modest at first, gave it a position of enormous potential. It sat on a triangular peninsula bordered by the Golden Horn, the Sea of Marmara, and the narrow straits leading to the Black Sea. From this promontory, one could command the sea lanes that link the Mediterranean with the resource-rich lands around the Black Sea. Whoever held Byzantium could control the movement of grain, fish, and other supplies that sustained cities from Athens to Rome. Yet for centuries, Byzantium remained a small city-state, occasionally drawn into the conflicts of larger powers, but never rising beyond the stature of a local hub. Its fortunes changed decisively only when Constantine the Great, having emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world in the early 4th century CE, chose it as the site of a new capital. Constantine's decision to transform Byzantium into Constantinople was both practical and symbolic. Rome itself, the ancient capital of the empire, had grown unwieldy. Its population was vast, its senatorial elite entrenched, and its distance from the frontier made it ill-suited as the nerve centre of a realm under constant threat. By contrast, Byzantium offered a defensible location closer to the empire's eastern provinces, which by then had become the most prosperous and strategically vital. Constantine recognised that power needed to be anchored where resources and threats converged. His foundation of Constantinople in 330 CE marked not only a shift of geography, but a redefinition of imperial vision. From this moment, the eastern Mediterranean became the empire's true centre. The site lent itself naturally to defence. The peninsula on which the city rose was protected by water on 3 sides. The Golden Horn formed a deep natural harbour, easily closed off by chains to prevent enemy ships from entering. The Sea of Marmara shielded the southern flank, while the Bosporus created a narrow bottleneck where fortifications could block naval approaches. On the landward side, the city was more exposed, but walls were erected to guard against assault. Later generations would expand these fortifications into massive layers of stone and towers, most famously under Theodosius II in the 5th century, when the triple line of walls stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara rendered Constantinople nearly impregnable. These defences allowed the city to withstand sieges for centuries, even as the rest of the empire contracted. Geography, more than any other factor, preserved the Byzantine state. The vision for the city was not limited to defence. Constantine intended it to embody imperial grandeur. He expanded its boundaries, laid out forums, aqueducts and palaces, and adorned it with monuments brought from across the empire. Statues of pagan gods and heroes were transported from Greece and Asia Minor to decorate public spaces, though increasingly Christian symbols defined its character. At its heart rose the imperial palace complex connected to the hippodrome, where chariot races and public ceremonies projected the emperor's presence to the people. Churches also became defining features, with Constantine commissioning the Church of the Holy Apostles as a dynastic mausoleum and the first iteration of Hagia Sophia. These structures gave the city both political and spiritual authority, binding imperial power to the Christian faith. The growth of Constantinople was rapid. Its population swelled as settlers, officials, artisans and soldiers arrived from across the empire. By the 5th century it rivaled Rome itself in size, housing perhaps 500,000 inhabitants. Its markets brimmed with goods from across the known world, grain from Egypt, silk from China, spices from India, furs from the north, and wine and oil from the Mediterranean. Artisans produced textiles, jewellery and weapons, while merchants organised trade networks that stretched across continents. The city became a cosmopolitan hub, where Latin officials, Greek citizens, Syrians, Armenians, Jews and others mingled. This diversity reflected both the empire's expanse and Constantinople's magnetic pull as the seat of power. Imperial ideology infused the city with unique character. Unlike Rome, which had grown organically over centuries, Constantinople was consciously designed as an imperial capital. It was presented as a new Rome, not in name alone, but in substance. Its Senate gave institutional continuity, even as its members were drawn increasingly from Eastern aristocracies. Its streets bore triumphal arches and columns celebrating victories, much as Rome had done. Yet the Christian identity of the new capital marked a departure. Where Rome had once housed countless temples to pagan gods, Constantinople became a city of churches and shrines. This fusion of Roman political traditions and Christian faith defined the Byzantine model. The emperor's successor to Augustus and Constantine, ruling by divine mandate as protector of the faith. The city's geography also made it an economic powerhouse. Positioned on the Bosporus, it controlled access to the Black Sea and the flow of grain, fish and raw materials from its northern shores. Trade routes from Asia funneled through its markets, bringing silk and spices, which were then carried westward. Its harbour, the Golden Horn, was crowded with ships of all sizes, unloading goods from Egypt, Syria and beyond. Customs duties, tolls and taxes on trade enriched the treasury, giving the empire a steady source of revenue. This wealth allowed emperors to maintain armies, build monumental structures, and finance elaborate ceremonies that projected authority. The imperial vision extended to urban life. Constantinople was a city of spectacle, where public events reinforced loyalty. The hippodrome was the epicenter of such life, hosting chariot races that drew tens of thousands. Factions, identified by colours such as blues and greens, commanded fierce allegiance, often intertwined with political rivalries. Emperors appeared before the crowds, their gestures and policies scrutinized. The relationship between ruler and populace was mediated through these public spectacles, where acclamations, demands, and even riots could shape imperial decisions. The Nika riot of 532, which nearly toppled Justinian's regime, demonstrated how volatile this arena could be, yet it also showed the centrality of Constantinople as the stage on which imperial legitimacy was enacted. The daily life of the city reflected both grandeur and hardship. Aqueducts supplied water to cisterns that sustained baths, fountains, and households. The Theodosian walls enclosed vast districts filled with markets, workshops, and dwellings. At the same time, overcrowding, poverty, and disease were constant companions of the urban poor. The distribution of grain and bread, a practice inherited from Rome, was maintained to prevent unrest. Monasteries and churches offered charity, while imperial officials monitored public order. The contrast between the splendour of the imperial palace and the struggles of ordinary residents was striking, but it was precisely this combination that gave Constantinople its resilience, a city that concentrated resources, authority, and faith in a single locus of power. The cultural life of Constantinople blended Roman and Greek traditions. Schools taught classical texts, rhetoric and philosophy alongside Christian theology. Libraries preserved works of antiquity, ensuring their transmission to later generations. Artists and craftsmen adorned churches with mosaics and icons, developing a distinctive aesthetic that conveyed both imperial authority and spiritual devotion. The city became not only a political capital but also an intellectual and artistic centre, radiating influence across the empire and beyond. Its mosaics, domes, and hymns embodied the fusion of empire and faith that defined Byzantine civilization. As centuries passed, Constantinople became synonymous with the empire itself. To lose provinces was painful, but as long as the city stood, the empire endured. Its walls resisted sieges by Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and many others. Its harbours sustained fleets that carried Byzantine power across seas. Its palaces hosted generations of emperors who enacted laws, waged wars, and convened councils. The city was both fortress and beacon, a reminder that Rome had not fallen but had been reborn on the Bosporus. To contemporaries, it was more than a capital. It was the embodiment of Roman continuity under Christian guardianship. The imperial vision of Constantinople extended outward, shaping the empire's diplomacy and foreign policy. Its position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia forced it into constant engagement with neighbouring peoples. Emperors hosted embassies from distant lands, receiving envoys in halls adorned with gold, marble, and mechanical marvels designed to impress. Accounts speak of golden lions that roared, jewelled trees that glittered, and thrones that rose as if by divine power, all intended to project the emperor's majesty. Such displays reinforced the image of Constantinople as not merely a city, but the axis of a cosmic order, where the Roman emperor ruled by divine sanction. The ideological claim of Constantinople as New Rome was reinforced by the Church. The Patriarch of Constantinople emerged as a leading figure in Christendom, rivaling the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Councils held in the city defined doctrine, and disputes between emperors and popes often centred on Constantinople's claim to equal or greater authority. This rivalry would shape the course of Christianity, culminating in schisms centuries later. Yet for the Byzantines, their capital was not only political but spiritual, a city chosen by God to safeguard true faith. The endurance of Constantinople was repeatedly tested, but its geography and fortifications proved decisive. When waves of invaders pressed against the empire's borders, the city stood firm. The Arabs besieged it in the 7th and 8th centuries, but Greek fire and the walls repelled them. Bulgars, Rus, and other powers tried their strength, only to be thwarted by its defences. Each failed assault reinforced the city's aura of invincibility. Its survival became synonymous with divine protection, strengthening the conviction that Constantinople was destined to endure as long as heaven willed. The grandeur of the city impressed not only its own inhabitants but also visitors from afar. Travellers from Western Europe, the Islamic world, and the steppes left accounts of its magnificence. They marvelled at the domes of its churches, the riches of its markets, and the ceremonies of its court. For many, Constantinople appeared as the greatest city in the world, a centre of wealth, faith, and authority unmatched elsewhere. This reputation persisted even as the empire's territories shrank. The city itself was empire enough, a jewel whose lustre could overshadow the loss of distant provinces. Constantinople's role as the foundation of Byzantine identity cannot be overstated. It was more than a capital, it was the essence of the empire. From its foundation under Constantine through centuries of triumphs and crises, it provided continuity. Its walls shielded emperors, its harbours fed populations, its palaces housed councils, and its churches preserved faith. Every transformation the empire underwent was anchored in the city's endurance. The Byzantine world, in all its complexity, found coherence in Constantinople's presence as the symbol of Roman continuity and Christian mission. When Justinian ascended to the throne in 527, the Byzantine Empire stood at a crossroads. The memory of Rome still carried weight, yet its power was fragmented, its territories contracted, and its resources strained. To Justinian, however, the imperial crown represented not merely a position of maintenance, but a mandate for renewal. His reign became synonymous with ambition, a conscious attempt to revive the grandeur of Rome, restore unity, and anchor imperial authority in a blend of military triumph, legal order, and spiritual magnificence. The scope of his vision was vast, and the decades of his rule reshaped the empire in ways that would define Byzantine history for centuries. Born into a humble family in the Balkans, Justinian was not of aristocratic origin, yet his rise revealed both personal ability and the shifting nature of imperial politics. His uncle, Justin the Mast, who had risen from the ranks of the imperial guard to seize the throne, brought him into the higher circles of power. From early on, Justinian demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for administration and a relentless devotion to the empire's destiny. Educated in Constantinople, immersed in theology, law, and the mechanics of government, he positioned himself as a man prepared to wield authority. When he became emperor, his determination was evident. He would not merely preserve the empire, but expand it, codify it, and sanctify it. The military campaigns of Justinian aimed to reclaim lands that had fallen away in the west. His general Belisarius, a figure of exceptional skill and loyalty, became the instrument of these ambitions. The campaign against the Vandals in North Africa in 533 unfolded with remarkable speed. Within months, the Vandal kingdom, which had ruled Carthage for nearly a century, collapsed. The Reconquest restored to the empire one of its most fertile provinces, a crucial source of grain and revenue. Triumph followed in Italy, where Belisarius waged a grueling war against the Ostrogoths. Cities like Rome, Ravenna, and Naples became battlegrounds, shifting hands repeatedly as sieges, betrayals, and campaigns dragged on for 2 decades. Eventually, the Ostrogothic kingdom was crushed, and Italy was restored to imperial authority. In Spain, too, imperial arms advanced, seizing parts of the southern coast from the Visigoths. For a moment, the Mediterranean once again seemed to circle under a single Roman dominion. Yet these triumphs came at immense cost. War drained the treasury, devastated populations, and stretched the empire's armies thin. The reconquered territories were not easily held. Italy, in particular, suffered from destruction, depopulation, and the challenge of constant resistance. The very ambition of Justinian revealed the limits of imperial power. What he achieved in military glory often strained the empire's capacity to govern. Still, the symbolism of restoration mattered deeply. To claim the title of Emperor of the Romans was to assert dominion over lands that had defined Roman greatness, and Justinian believed that only by reclaiming them could his rule achieve its full legitimacy. If war sought to restore external grandeur, Justinian's codification of Roman law sought to restore internal order. Roman jurisprudence had accumulated over centuries in a mass of statutes, edicts, and interpretations. Much was contradictory, obscure, or inaccessible. Justinian recognized that without systematic organization, law risked confusion and decay. He commissioned a comprehensive project to collect, refine, and preserve the empire's legal heritage. Under the direction of Tribonian, a brilliant jurist, the work produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This compilation included the Codex, collecting imperial edicts, the Digest, summarizing the writings of jurists, the Institutes, a textbook for students, and later the Novellae, new laws issued during Justinian's reign. The achievement was monumental. The law became a coherent system, accessible to officials, judges, and scholars. It affirmed the emperor's role as the ultimate source of legislation, embedding authority in a framework that combined Roman tradition with Christian morality. For Justinian, law was not merely administration, it was an expression of divine order. To rule justly was to reflect God's will, and the codification of law became a sacred duty. The Corpus Juris Civilis outlived Justinian by centuries, shaping legal thought across medieval Europe and influencing the foundations of modern civil law traditions. Through this project, the Byzantine Empire became the custodian of Roman jurisprudence, preserving a legacy that might otherwise have vanished. Religion and theology occupied as central a place in Justinian's vision as war and law. The emperor saw himself as protector of orthodoxy, responsible for defending the church from heresy and ensuring unity of belief. This conviction led him to intervene repeatedly in theological disputes, convening councils, issuing decrees, and attempting to reconcile divisions. The monophysitic controversy, which divided those who believed in the single divine nature of Christ from those who upheld the doctrine of two natures, human and divine, became a particular focus. Justinian sought to balance conciliation with enforcement, alternately attempting to win over dissenters and imposing imperial authority. His efforts often alienated as much as they reconciled, but they reflected the Byzantine conception of empire as both political and spiritual. The emperor was not merely a secular ruler, but a vicegerent of God, answerable for the purity of faith within his dominion. This fusion of faith and authority found its most visible expression in architecture. After the devastation of the Nika riot in 532, which destroyed much of Constantinople, Justinian embarked on a program of rebuilding that reshaped the city. At its heart stood the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, designed by the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. When it was completed in 537, it stunned contemporaries with its scale and beauty. Its massive dome, suspended seemingly without support, soared above the nave, catching light that poured through rows of windows. Mosaics glittered on its walls, and marble of every hue decorated its surfaces. For those who entered, the effect was overwhelming, as if stepping into a vision of heaven itself. The Hagia Sophia became the symbol of Byzantine greatness, embodying the fusion of imperial power, Christian faith, and architectural ingenuity. Justinian is said to have declared upon its completion, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," a statement that revealed both his pride and his sense of divine mission. The Hagia Sophia was more than a building. It was a statement of ideology. It proclaimed that the emperor's authority was divinely sanctioned, that the empire was the dwelling place of holy wisdom, and that Constantinople was the heart of Christendom. Services held within its walls combined elaborate liturgy, music, and ritual, projecting the majesty of both God and emperor. Foreign visitors, from Slavic envoys to Western pilgrims, described their awe at its splendour. For centuries, it defined the skyline of the city, a constant reminder of Justinian's vision and of the empire's identity as Christian Rome. The grandeur of Justinian's reign was shadowed by crises. The plague of Justinian, beginning in 541, ravaged the empire for decades. Originating in Egypt and spreading along trade routes, it struck Constantinople with devastating force. Contemporary accounts describe corpses piling in the streets, ships adrift with dead crews, and entire regions depopulated. Modern estimates suggest that perhaps a third to half of the population perished. The demographic collapse crippled the economy, reduced tax revenues, and weakened the army. The empire, already strained by wars and ambitious building projects, now faced the burden of disease on a scale unseen before. Justinian himself fell ill but survived. The empire endured, but the scars were deep and recovery was slow. Despite these trials, Justinian's determination did not falter. He continued to legislate, to build, and to wage war. his reign stretched to nearly 4 decades, a period of relentless activity that left the empire both enriched and exhausted. The reconquests restored prestige but sowed new challenges. The legal codification preserved order but demanded constant enforcement. The Hagia Sophia and other projects adorned the capital but drained resources. By the time of his death in 565, the empire was larger, more unified in law, and more magnificent in architecture than it had been in centuries, yet also stretched thin and vulnerable to future pressures. Justinian's age defined the character of Byzantium in ways that endured long after him. It revealed the balance between ambition and limitation, the pursuit of restoration, and the acceptance of adaptation. It showed how emperors saw themselves as guardians of both empire and church, wielding authority that was at once political, legal, and spiritual. It left monuments, laws, and legends that continued to shape Byzantine identity. And as new challenges arose, Persian wars, Slavic migrations, Arab conquests, the memory of Justinian's reign provided both inspiration and caution, a reminder of what could be achieved and what dangers such ambition carried. The reign of Justinian, so often remembered for its triumphs of conquest, law, and architecture, was also scarred by one of the most devastating pandemics in recorded history. Beginning in the year 542, the empire was struck by a plague that spread with terrifying speed, undermining the very foundations of society. This disease, which historians have come to call the Plague of Justinian, recurred in waves for nearly 2 centuries, leaving behind profound consequences for the empire's economy, military, and demography. In scale and impact, it rivaled the greatest catastrophes of antiquity and became one of the most enduring trials Byzantium would ever face. The origins of the plague lay in the interconnectedness of the empire itself. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of the Mediterranean world, linked by trade routes to Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and beyond. Ships carrying grain from Egypt were among the lifelines of the capital, feeding its population and sustaining its markets. Yet those same ships carried rats, and the rats bore fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The conditions of urban life, with crowded housing, limited sanitation, and dense populations, provided fertile ground for the disease to spread. Once introduced, it coursed through the city, sparing neither rich nor poor, striking indiscriminately across social boundaries. Contemporary accounts convey the horror of the epidemic. Procopius, the historian of Justinian's wars and reign, described streets filled with corpses, so numerous that burial grounds could not contain them. Bodies were loaded onto carts and dumped into the sea, yet still the dead outpaced the living's ability to manage them. Constantinople, a city that may have housed 500,000 inhabitants, lost tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. Some modern estimates suggest that in its first wave, the plague killed as many as 1/4 to 1/3 of the city's population. The emperor himself fell ill but recovered, a reminder to his subjects that even the highest were not immune. The effects were not limited to the capital. The plague spread along the empire's arteries, reaching Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Italy, Gaul, and Spain. In Egypt, it struck the very provinces on which the empire depended for grain. In Syria, it emptied villages and weakened defences against Persian rivals. Soldiers fell in the field, farmers died in their fields, and merchants perished along trade routes. No region was untouched, and the mortality was compounded by the recurrence of the disease in later years. Unlike a single catastrophe, the plague returned in waves throughout the 6th, 7th, and even into the 8th century. Each resurgence renewed trauma and slowed recovery, embedding the pandemic as a defining feature of the Byzantine experience. The economic consequences were immense. Agriculture, the backbone of the empire, suffered from the loss of labourers. Fields went untilled, harvest diminished, and shortages drove up the price of grain. Urban markets contracted, and workshops lost workers. Tax revenues, already strained by the costs of war and building projects, collapsed as populations dwindled. The imperial government attempted to enforce tax collection even in depopulated areas, leading to resentment and resistance. Records indicate entire villages abandoned, their lands falling out of cultivation. The fiscal strength of the state, so vital for sustaining armies and administration, faltered under the weight of demographic collapse. The military, which had carried out Justinian's ambitious reconquests, also bore the brunt of the disaster. Armies shrank as disease ravaged their ranks, and recruitment became more difficult as populations fell. Campaigns in Italy, already grueling, became harder to sustain. Garrisons along the eastern frontier faced shortages of manpower, just as Persia pressed its advantage. The empire's enemies were not unaffected. Plague spread into Persia as well, but the Byzantine state, with its heavy burdens of reconquest and defence, found itself stretched beyond endurance. What victories had been won in the early part of Justinian's reign now required constant struggle to preserve, and the plague tipped the balance toward exhaustion. The psychological impact of the epidemic was profound. In a society that understood disease as divine punishment, the plague was interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure. Priests and bishops called for repentance, processions and prayers. Some saw the plague as a judgment on imperial ambition, others as a trial meant to purify the faithful. Popular piety mingled with fear, producing waves of anxiety that disrupted daily life. Families were torn apart as individuals fled cities, hoping to escape contagion. Monasteries became refuges for some, while others turned to apocalyptic speculation, imagining the end of days was at hand. The empire's religious identity, already central to its politics, was tested in ways that deepened both devotion and division. The plague also left a lasting mark on imperial policy. Justinian, despite his illness, continued to legislate, and some of his laws reveal responses to demographic crisis. Regulations on inheritance, property rights and contracts addressed the reality of widespread death. With so many estates left without heirs, property reverted to the state, providing some compensation for lost tax revenues. Yet these measures were insufficient to offset the scale of decline. The empire's administrative machinery struggled to adapt, and in many cases the rigidity of the system compounded hardship rather than alleviating it. Even as the empire endured the plague, other struggles pressed upon it. The wars in Italy dragged on, consuming resources. In Africa, local revolts challenged imperial authority. On the eastern frontier, Persia remained a constant threat, launching invasions and seizing territories, while Byzantine defences faltered. The Slavic and Avar incursions into the Balkans intensified, exploiting the weakness left by depopulation. The empire, which under Justinian had seemed poised to restore Roman greatness, now found itself fighting merely to survive on multiple fronts. The cultural memory of the plague endured long after its first wave. Chroniclers described its horrors in vivid terms, ensuring that future generations would remember. The sense of vulnerability it instilled shaped Byzantine attitudes toward health, religion, and empire. Rituals of purification, prayers for deliverance, and the prominence of saints associated with healing became more deeply woven into daily life. The empire learned to live with the recurrence of disease, adjusting expectations and rhythms of life around the possibility of sudden devastation. Modern scholarship has debated the extent of the plague's long-term impact. Some argue that it marked a turning point, reducing the population so drastically that the empire could never again sustain the expansive power of early Byzantium. Others suggest that while catastrophic, the plague was one of many factors that strained the empire, alongside constant wars, economic burdens, and political disputes. Regardless of the balance, it is clear that the plague reshaped the context in which Byzantium operated. It limited the capacity for expansion, forced new strategies of defence, and underscored the fragility of human endeavour against forces beyond control. In the centuries that followed, the empire would continue to face trials of equal magnitude, from the rise of Islam to the pressures of new migrations. But the memory of the plague of Justinian lingered as one of the greatest challenges. It revealed the limits of imperial ambition, demonstrated the vulnerability of even the greatest cities, and impressed upon Byzantium the need for resilience. The empire survived, though changed, carrying forward through an age not of triumph but of endurance, in which survival itself became the highest achievement. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persians was defined by rivalry that stretched across centuries, a contest for supremacy that outlasted dynasties and shaped the destinies of both realms. Byzantium, heir to the Roman tradition, stood as the dominant power of the Mediterranean and Balkans, while Persia commanded the highlands of Iran and the rich provinces of Mesopotamia. Between them lay frontiers marked not only by fortresses and armies, but also by centuries of accumulated mistrust and occasional fragile truces. When Justinian and his successors sought to extend their empire's reach, they inevitably collided with the strength of Persia, and the wars that followed tested both empires in ways that revealed the shifting balance of the ancient world and prepared the stage for entirely new powers that would emerge from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. The roots of this rivalry stretch back to the days of the Parthians, but under the Sasanian dynasty, founded in the 3rd century, the Persian state consolidated into a formidable adversary. The Sasanians projected themselves as heirs to the great Achaemenid kings, and they governed with a strong central monarchy buttressed by an aristocracy and Zoroastrian priesthood. They ruled over the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and regions stretching into Central Asia, providing both economic resources and manpower for their armies. To the Byzantines, they were both dangerous neighbours and valuable trading partners, for luxury goods such as silk passed through Persian routes, even as armies clashed along the Euphrates. The frontier between the two empires was not a fixed line, but a zone of shifting control, where fortresses, cities, and caravan routes changed hands as wars ebbed and flowed. Justinian's reign inevitably brought him into conflict with Persia. Even as Belisarius marched in triumph across Africa and Italy, the eastern frontier demanded attention. The war that broke out in 527, shortly after Justinian took power, revealed the persistence of the rivalry. Campaigns were fought across Mesopotamia and Armenia, regions that often bore the brunt of imperial struggles. Cities such as Dara, fortified by the Byzantines, became focal points of conflict. At Dara in 530, Belisarius achieved a significant victory, demonstrating tactical brilliance by deploying his troops in layered formations to repel Persian cavalry. Yet victories were offset by setbacks, and no decisive resolution was reached. In 532, Justinian sought respite through what became known as the Eternal Peace, a treaty with the Persians that secured a temporary truce at the cost of subsidies paid to the Sasanian king. The peace, despite its name, proved anything but eternal, for within a decade hostilities resumed. The renewed war from 540 onward brought devastation, most notably with the Persian sack of Antioch, one of the great cities of the Byzantine East. Khosrow III, the Sasanian king known as Anushirvan, led his armies deep into Byzantine territory, capturing towns, exacting tribute, and demonstrating the empire's vulnerability. Antioch, with its vibrant trade and culture, was plundered and its inhabitants deported. The humiliation shook Constantinople, reminding Justinian that even as he sought to restore Rome in the west, the east remained perilously exposed. The wars drained resources, forced new fortifications, and revealed the difficulty of maintaining simultaneous campaigns on multiple fronts. Despite intermittent treaties, the wars with Persia persisted into the later 6th century. Successive emperors, including Justin the Sale and Tiberius II, grappled with the demands of defence. The Persians, under rulers like Hormizd IV and later Khosrow II, pressed their advantage. the frontier provinces became zones of constant tension, where fortresses were rebuilt, garrisons rotated, and civilians endured cycles of raids and reconquest. The wars were not solely about territory, but about prestige, legitimacy, and the balance of power in the ancient world. Each empire saw itself as the rightful ruler of the civilized world, and neither was willing to concede dominance. The reign of Maurice, beginning in 582, brought temporary stability. A soldier emperor, Maurice reorganized the army and secured a treaty that favored Byzantium, even installing a friendly claimant on the Persian throne. Yet this moment of advantage was short-lived. When Maurice was overthrown in 602, executed after a revolt led by the usurper Phocas, Persia seized the opportunity for revenge. Khosrow, too, claiming to avenge his benefactor, launched one of the most devastating invasions Byzantium had ever faced. The Persian armies swept across the eastern provinces, capturing Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. Jerusalem fell in 614, and the true cross, Christianity's holiest relic, was carried off to Persia. Alexandria, the empire's second city, and a crucial source of grain, was lost. By the 620s, Persian forces reached as far as Chalcedon, directly across the Bosporus from Constantinople itself. This period of near collapse revealed the empire's fragility. The wealth of Egypt was cut off, the holy places of Christianity desecrated, and the legitimacy of the Byzantine emperor deeply undermined. For a moment it seemed as though Persia might succeed in destroying Byzantium altogether. Yet the empire proved more resilient than appearances suggested. In 610, a new emperor rose to power, Heraclius, a general from North Africa, who would lead the empire through its darkest hour with determination and reform. Heraclius inherited an empire on the brink, with enemies on every side and the treasury empty. Yet he reorganized the state, drawing resources from the church, remobilizing armies, and appealing to the people's sense of Christian mission. His campaigns beginning in 622 turned the tide. Instead of fighting defensively in the lowlands of Mesopotamia and Syria, he marched boldly into the Persian heartland, conducting daring raids deep into enemy territory. His victories, particularly at Nineveh in 627, broke Persian power. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own nobles, and peace was restored. The terms of settlement were favourable to Byzantium: the return of lost provinces, the restoration of the true cross, and the re-establishment of borders. For a brief moment, the empire seemed to have triumphed against overwhelming odds. Yet this apparent triumph was deceptive, for both empires emerged exhausted. Decades of war had drained treasuries, depopulated provinces, and left fortresses in ruins. The Byzantines reclaimed their lands, but these territories were devastated and vulnerable. The Persians, meanwhile, suffered internal turmoil, with rapid successions of kings and political instability. Neither empire knew that even as they fought each other to the brink of destruction, a new power was rising in the Arabian Peninsula that would soon transform the balance of the region entirely. The frontier wars had long forced Byzantium to focus its energies on the east, but in doing so they reshaped the character of the empire. Constant warfare led to military reforms, the construction of new fortresses, and the development of strategies suited to protracted defence. The reliance on fortified cities, the importance of mobile cavalry units, and the integration of religious rhetoric into military campaigns all became hallmarks of Byzantine resilience. The wars also bound the empire's identity ever more closely to Christianity, as emperors presented their struggles against Persia as battles of faith as well as politics. The recovery of the true cross by Heraclius symbolized not merely political victory but divine vindication. The centuries-long rivalry with Persia revealed both the persistence of Roman traditions and the inevitability of change. By the time peace was secured in the early 7th century, Byzantium had demonstrated extraordinary resilience, but it had also been pushed to its limits. The rise of new frontiers was not merely geographical but civilizational, as the struggles with Persia opened the way for the Arab conquest that would soon redefine the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Byzantium, weary from war but still unbroken, would face an entirely different challenge, one that would transform its borders, its politics, and its very conception of survival. When Heraclius came to the throne in 610, the Byzantine Empire stood on the edge of collapse. The Persians had overrun much of the eastern provinces, the Balkans were exposed to Avar and Slavic incursions, and the capital itself was threatened. The treasury was empty, the army depleted, and morale broken. Yet Heraclius, a general from Carthage, took up the crown with determination and reshaped the empire through reforms, daring campaigns, and religious appeals that transformed Byzantium's struggle for survival into a cause infused with faith. His reign marked one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in imperial history, as he rescued the empire from destruction at Persian hands, only to face an entirely new and unexpected challenge from the rising force of Islam. Heraclius began by stabilizing his position at Constantinople. The overthrow of Phocas had placed him in power, but the state he inherited was nearly ungovernable. The Persians controlled Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor's eastern provinces, cutting the empire off from vital revenues and resources. The Avars and Slavs pressed in the Balkans, raiding as far as the walls of Constantinople. To save the empire, Heraclius took extraordinary measures. He reorganized the army by drawing on provincial resources, reducing reliance on central pay, and establishing systems that would later evolve into the thematic structure of Byzantine defense. He also turned to the church, melting down treasures and requisitioning funds to pay soldiers and sustain campaigns. The crisis blurred the lines between sacred and secular, as bishops and clergy became partners in the defense of the empire. In 622, Heraclius launched a bold counter-offensive against Persia. Unlike previous emperors who fought defensively along the frontier, he struck deep into Persian territory, carrying the war into the enemy's heartland. His campaigns were arduous, marked by long marches, winter campaigns in Armenia, and battles fought far from Constantinople. Yet his daring bore fruit. In 627, he won a decisive victory at Nineveh, breaking the Persian army and shattering their confidence. Khosrow Sekhu was overthrown by his own nobles, and a new regime sought peace. The terms were favourable. Byzantium recovered its lost territories, and the True Cross, captured at Jerusalem years earlier, was returned in triumph to Constantinople. For a moment it seemed that Heraclius had restored the empire's fortunes, achieving victories that rivaled those of Justinian. The triumph, however, was fragile. Decades of war had devastated provinces, depopulated cities, and strained resources. The empire, though victorious, was exhausted. It was at this moment of precarious recovery that a new force emerged from Arabia. In the lifetime of Heraclius, tribes from the Arabian Peninsula, recently united by the preaching of Muhammad and galvanized by a new religious mission, surged into the territories of both Byzantium and Persia. What began as raids along desert frontiers quickly grew into a movement that neither empire, weakened by years of mutual struggle, could contain. The first encounters between Byzantium and the Arabs occurred in the 630s, shortly after Muhammad's death in 632. The newly formed Muslim community, under the leadership of the caliphs, directed its energies outward in campaigns of astonishing speed and scale. The Byzantine province of Syria, already weakened by Persian occupation and Byzantine reconquest, became the first target. Heraclius, aware of the threat, mustered forces to defend the region, but his armies were no longer what they had been. Recruitment was difficult, morale uncertain, and the loyalty of local populations divided. Religious tensions between Chalcedonian Christians, monophysites, and Jews created fractures within society, and many inhabitants viewed Byzantine authority with suspicion. The decisive confrontation came in 636 at the Battle of Yarmouk. Heraclius, too ill to lead in person, relied on his generals to command the Byzantine forces. The battle unfolded over several days along the ravines of the Yarmouk River, near the borders of modern Syria and Jordan. Despite their numbers, the Byzantine troops were outmaneuvered by the Arab cavalry and overwhelmed by their cohesion and determination. The defeat was catastrophic. Entire units were annihilated, and the Byzantine position in Syria collapsed. Within a few years, Damascus, Antioch and Jerusalem fell to the Arabs. In 638, the Patriarch Sophronius surrendered Jerusalem to the Caliph Umar, marking the loss of one of Christianity's holiest cities. The impact of Yarmouk reverberated throughout the empire. Heraclius, once the restorer of Roman glory, now presided over unprecedented losses. The loss of Syria was followed by the loss of Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. Arab forces advanced into the Nile Valley, and by 642 Alexandria had fallen. The province that had supplied Constantinople with grain for centuries was gone. The Byzantines attempted to retake it, but their efforts failed, and Egypt became permanently integrated into the new Islamic Caliphate. The loss of this province was not merely territorial, but economic and strategic. Without Egypt's grain, the capital had to rely more heavily on supplies from the Black Sea, altering the empire's economic lifelines. Heraclius, who had once marched into Persia as a conqueror, now withdrew into Constantinople, his health failing and his spirit broken. Chroniclers described him as aged and disheartened, lamenting the losses that had undone his victories. The shift in power was dramatic. Within a single generation, the Byzantine Empire had gone from defeating Persia and recovering the true cross to losing vast stretches of its eastern provinces to a power previously unknown on the world stage. The empire's frontiers were transformed, its resources diminished, and its self-confidence shaken. The clash with Islam reshaped the Byzantine world in ways far beyond immediate military defeats. The empire's identity as the Roman state, guardian of Christian orthodoxy, now confronted a rival civilization that claimed divine mandate of its own. The Arabs brought not only military power, but also a religious vision that challenged Byzantium's universal claims. For centuries, the Byzantines had regarded their emperor as God's chosen ruler on earth, responsible for maintaining orthodoxy and order. Now they faced an adversary who saw themselves as the true bearers of divine truth, spreading Islam across lands that had once been under Roman and Christian dominion. The new frontier forced Byzantium to adapt. With Syria, Palestine and Egypt lost, the empire's focus shifted increasingly toward Asia Minor, the Balkans and the Aegean. The thematic system rooted in Heraclius's reforms became the basis of defence, with soldiers settled on land in return for military service. Constantinople itself grew even more central, its walls and harbours becoming the ultimate shield of the empire. Naval power, particularly the use of Greek fire, would play a growing role in defending against Arab sieges and raids. The empire contracted, but in contracting, it became more defensible, more tightly organised, and more clearly defined as a Greek-speaking Christian state. Heraclius did not live to see the full consequences of this transformation. He died in 641, leaving a legacy of both triumph and tragedy. His victories over Persia saved the empire from annihilation, but his final years were overshadowed by defeats against the Arabs that redrew the map of the eastern Mediterranean. To contemporaries, his reign was a paradox. He had recovered the true cross and led daring campaigns that rivaled the exploits of ancient emperors, yet he had also presided over the greatest territorial losses in Byzantine history up to that point. The empire he left to his heirs was smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable, but it was also more concentrated, more resilient, and poised to endure centuries of struggle against the new Islamic powers that now dominated its southern frontiers. The first clash with Islam was not the end of Byzantium, but it was the beginning of a new era in which survival required adaptation, innovation, and resilience. The wars with Persia had nearly destroyed the empire, but the challenge of Islam transformed it permanently. From this point forward, Byzantium would no longer see itself as the master of the Mediterranean world, but as the defender of a Christian bastion, hemmed in by rivals, yet capable of remarkable endurance. The Byzantine Empire in the 8th and 9th centuries faced not only external threats from Arabs, Bulgars and other rivals, but also an internal conflict that shook its very foundations. This conflict was not about territory or armies, but about faith, images, and the nature of Christian worship itself. Known to history as iconoclasm, it erupted when emperors and their supporters sought to ban the veneration of icons, the sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints that had become central to Byzantine devotion. The controversy divided emperors from patriarchs, soldiers from monks, and entire communities from one another. It was a crisis that touched every level of society, blending theology with politics, and leaving scars that endured for generations. To understand why the veneration of images became so central in Byzantium, one must recall the empire's spiritual culture. Churches throughout the empire were adorned with mosaics, frescoes, and icons, depicting biblical scenes and holy figures. These images were not merely decoration. They were believed to mediate the divine, offering a window into the sacred and serving as focal points for prayer. Believers kissed icons, lit lamps before them, and carried them in processions. In times of war, icons were brought onto the battlefield, believed to protect soldiers and ensure victory. Monasteries in particular became centres of icon devotion, producing and preserving these images as part of their spiritual life. To many Byzantines, to remove the icons would have been to strip away the visible presence of the divine in daily life. Yet some voices in the church had long expressed unease with the practice. Critics argued that the veneration of images risked slipping into idolatry, violating the biblical commandment against graven images. Theological debates about the nature of Christ, his divinity and humanity, also intersected with the question of images. Could an image truly depict the divine nature of Christ, or did it reduce him to mere humanity? These questions simmered for centuries but came to a head under Emperor Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741. In a world under pressure from external enemies and natural disasters, Leo believed that the empire's misfortunes reflected divine displeasure. Convinced that the veneration of images was sinful, he began a campaign to remove them from churches. In 726, Leo issued his first edict against icons, ordering the destruction of certain images and forbidding their public veneration. Resistance was immediate. Monks, deeply devoted to icons, opposed the emperor's policies, and many clergy sided with them. Ordinary believers, who had woven icons into their spiritual lives, resisted attempts to strip them away. Yet Leo persisted, expanding his decrees and using imperial authority to enforce them. Iconoclasm was not merely a theological stance, it became a state policy, defended by the army and bureaucracy. The empire was divided into iconoclasts, those who opposed images, and iconodules, those who supported them. The controversy was not only religious but also political, for to oppose the emperor's decrees was to challenge his authority itself. The conflict intensified under Constantine V, Leo's son, who reigned from 741 to 775. Constantine pursued iconoclasm with even greater zeal, convening a council in 754 at Hieria that condemned icons as heretical. His policies extended beyond theology into persecution of opponents. Monks were targeted, monasteries dissolved, and defenders of icons imprisoned, exiled, or even executed. Constantine sought to reshape the empire's spiritual culture, replacing icons with the cross as the primary symbol of devotion. He promoted military success as evidence of divine favour for his policies, pointing to victories over the Bulgars as proof that God had blessed iconoclasm. For decades, the empire was torn between imperial enforcement and popular resistance. The opposition to iconoclasm was not crushed, however. In remote monasteries, icons were hidden and preserved. The writings of defenders such as John of Damascus articulated theological arguments for icons, distinguishing between veneration given to images and worship owed only to God. Icons, they argued, did not represent the divine essence, but depicted the human reality of Christ, affirming his incarnation. To reject icons was, in their view, to deny the fullness of Christ's humanity and the legitimacy of his visible presence in the world. These arguments gradually gained strength, keeping the iconodual cause alive even under persecution. The first phase of iconoclasm ended in 787, when Empress Irene, acting as regent for her young son Constantine VI, convened the Second Council of Nicaea. This ecumenical council affirmed the veneration of icons, distinguishing between honour given to images and worship given only to God. The restoration of icons was celebrated across the empire, and Irene positioned herself as a restorer of orthodoxy. Yet the resolution was not permanent. In 815, under Emperor Leo V, iconoclasm was revived, ushering in a second period of conflict that lasted for decades. Once again, emperors enforced bans, monks resisted, and society fractured along lines of belief and loyalty. The second phase of iconoclasm reflected not only theology, but also the empire's political and military fortunes. As Byzantium struggled against external threats, emperors turned again to the idea that divine displeasure explained their hardships, and the veneration of icons became a convenient target. Yet the resilience of the iconodual movement ensured that the controversy would not disappear. Monks continued to produce and hide icons, believers continued to venerate them in secret, and theological defences circulated widely. It was only in 843, under the regency of Empress Theodora, that iconoclasm was finally defeated. Theodora, ruling on behalf of her son Michael III, restored the veneration of icons in a triumphal ceremony in Constantinople. The event became known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, and was celebrated annually in the church calendar thereafter. From that moment forward, the veneration of icons was firmly entrenched in Byzantine spirituality and identity. The wounds left by more than a century of conflict, however, lingered. Monasteries bore scars of persecution, theological divisions left bitterness, and the authority of emperors had been challenged and reshaped by the controversy. Iconoclasm revealed the unique relationship between church and state in Byzantium. Unlike in the Latin West, where the papacy increasingly asserted independence from secular rulers, in Byzantium the emperor remained deeply involved in defining doctrine and enforcing orthodoxy. The iconoclast emperors saw themselves as guardians of faith, even as their actions split the church. Their opponents, often monks and clerics, resisted in the name of true belief, sometimes at the cost of their lives. The conflict illustrated both the power and the limits of imperial authority over the church, a tension that would resurface in many forms throughout Byzantine history. The controversy also left a profound impact on art and culture. The destruction of icons meant the loss of countless works of art, mosaics, and paintings. Some churches were stripped bare, their walls whitewashed, their images obliterated. Yet in the aftermath of iconoclasm, the renewed flourishing of icon painting and mosaic art was all the more striking. The theology that emerged from the struggle gave icons an even deeper significance, embedding them as central expressions of Byzantine devotion. The artistic traditions that developed after 843 were shaped by the memory of conflict, emphasizing the theological legitimacy of images and the glory of their restoration. For ordinary Byzantines, iconoclasm was not an abstract theological debate, but a lived crisis. It touched how they prayed, what they saw in their churches, and how they related to their emperor. Families were divided, communities torn apart, and loyalties tested. The trauma of more than a century of controversy reinforced the sense that faith in Byzantium was inseparable from politics, that imperial decisions could reshape spiritual life in the most intimate ways. The endurance of devotion to icons, even under persecution, testified to the depth of popular piety and the resilience of monastic communities. By the time iconoclasm ended, Byzantium was no longer the same empire it had been in the days of Heraclius. The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt was permanent. The empire's frontiers had contracted, and its identity had become more firmly rooted in its Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian heartland. The crisis of faith over icons, though destructive, helped to crystallize Byzantine religious culture. Icons were no longer vulnerable to suspicion, but became central to the empire's sense of itself. The triumph of orthodoxy was not only a theological resolution, but a cultural one, marking a turning point in the empire's history of faith. The end of iconoclasm in the 9th century opened the way for a new era in Byzantine history, one often described as a renaissance, when the empire experienced cultural renewal, territorial resurgence, and a sense of stability not seen for generations. This period is associated with the so-called Macedonian dynasty, beginning with Basileia in 867, and lasting through his descendants until the early 11th century. Under their leadership, Byzantium regained strength both within and beyond its borders, achieving military victories, diplomatic influence, and a flowering of literature, art, and learning. The centuries of contraction and crisis were followed by an age of restoration, when the empire once again asserted itself as a dominant power in the medieval world. The rise of Basil I is one of the more striking stories of Byzantine political fortune. Born into a humble peasant family in the theme of Macedonia, his origins were obscure, and his early life was marked by poverty. Yet through talent, determination, and the shifting tides of court intrigue, he rose to prominence. He entered the service of Emperor Michael III, known as the Drunkard by later chroniclers, and gained influence as a trusted companion. Basil's ability to navigate court politics and his skill in managing relationships allowed him to secure power, eventually supplanting Michael and establishing himself as emperor in 867. Though later historians embellished his story with tales of divine favour and miraculous encounters, Basil's rise reflected the permeability of Byzantine society, where a man of low birth could, through skill and luck, ascend to the throne. Basil IV founded a dynasty that lasted for nearly 2 centuries, providing continuity at a time when the empire desperately needed stability. His reign emphasized consolidation. He reformed the administration, reorganized the legal code, and supported the church. Though not a scholar himself, he encouraged intellectual activity, commissioning works of law that simplified and clarified earlier compilations, making them more accessible to officials and judges. His reign also strengthened the alliance between the emperor and the Orthodox Church, reinforcing the religious unity that had been tested by iconoclasm. In many ways, Basil laid the foundation for the achievements of his successors, who would expand upon his work to create an era of resurgence. Under Basil's descendants, particularly Leo VI, Constantine VII, and Basil III, the empire flourished. Leo VI, known as the Wise, reigned from 886 to 912 and was noted for his scholarship and interest in law. He issued the Basilica, a massive collection of laws written in Greek that updated and expanded Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. The use of Greek, rather than Latin, reflected the empire's cultural transformation, as Greek had become the dominant language of administration and daily life. Leo also wrote on theology, military tactics and ceremony, leaving behind works that illuminate the intellectual climate of the period. His reign showed how emperors combined governance with scholarship, embodying both rulers and patrons of culture. Constantine VII, known as Porphyrogenitus, or Born in the Purple, reigned from 913 to 959, though much of his life was spent as a figurehead under regents and co-emperors. A scholar of great energy, he sponsored works on history, administration, and diplomacy. His writings, such as De Administrando Imperio, provided practical guidance on governing the empire and dealing with foreign peoples. These texts not only served contemporary needs, but also preserved valuable knowledge for later historians. Constantine's reign symbolized the fusion of imperial authority and intellectual life, as the emperor himself engaged in scholarship, while also encouraging a broader renaissance of learning. The military achievements of the Macedonian dynasty were equally significant. After centuries of contraction, the empire began to expand again, reclaiming territories lost to Arabs and strengthening its borders. Byzantine armies pushed into eastern Anatolia, northern Syria and the Balkans, defeating enemies and securing frontiers. Generals such as Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes became celebrated for their campaigns, restoring confidence in the empire's martial capabilities. The reconquest of Crete in 961, after more than a century under Arab control, was a triumph that secured the Aegean Sea from piracy and restored vital trade routes. The capture of Antioch in 969 further extended Byzantine authority, re-establishing a strong presence in Syria. These victories did not restore the empire's old dominance over the entire Mediterranean, but they marked a clear resurgence of power. The Balkans also became a theatre of expansion. Byzantine influence over Bulgaria, a long-standing rival, grew stronger during this period, though the struggle would reach its height under Basil II. Through diplomacy, marriage alliances and military campaigns, the Macedonian emperors asserted authority over Slavic peoples, spreading Byzantine culture, religion and administration. The Christianization of the Slavs, particularly through the missions of Saints Cyril and Methodius, extended Byzantine influence into regions that would long remain within the Orthodox sphere. The Slavic adoption of Christianity, liturgy and script based on Greek models testified to the cultural reach of Byzantium during the Macedonian era. This revival was not only military and political, but also cultural. The period saw a flourishing of art, architecture, and intellectual life, often referred to as the Macedonian Renaissance. Manuscripts were copied and illuminated with care, preserving classical texts and theological works. Monasteries became centres of learning, producing commentaries, chronicles, and hymns. Churches built or restored during this period displayed a renewed emphasis on mosaics and icons, with a style that combined grandeur with spiritual depth. The Hagia Sophia, still standing at the heart of Constantinople, remained the model, but new churches throughout the empire reflected the vitality of Byzantine devotion. Education received renewed attention. Schools in Constantinople and other cities trained officials, clergy and scholars, ensuring a steady supply of educated elites who could administer the empire and defend its orthodoxy. The preservation of ancient Greek texts during this time was especially important, as it ensured the transmission of classical knowledge to later generations, including the scholars of the Islamic world and eventually the Latin West. The Macedonian dynasty's support for learning secured Byzantium's role as a custodian of classical heritage, a bridge between antiquity and medieval civilization. Economically, the empire experienced recovery and growth. Agricultural productivity stabilized as frontiers became more secure and trade routes reopened as piracy and raids declined. Constantinople thrived as a commercial hub, drawing merchants from across the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and beyond. Goods such as silk, grain, spices and metals flowed through its markets, enriching the imperial treasury and sustaining the population. The coinage remained stable, reinforcing confidence in the empire's economy. The ability to finance armies, building projects and cultural patronage reflected a healthier and more resilient state. The culmination of the Macedonian dynasty's military achievements came under Basil's end, who reigned from 976 to 1025. Known as the Bulgar Slayer, he dedicated much of his reign to the long struggle against Bulgaria, which had grown powerful under Tsar Samuel. The conflict lasted decades, marked by campaigns of attrition, sieges and shifting fortunes. Basil's determination, discipline and administrative skill eventually wore down Bulgarian resistance. In 1014, at the Battle of Cleidion, he captured thousands of Bulgarian soldiers and, according to chroniclers, had them blinded before sending them back to their ruler. The psychological blow, combined with relentless campaigns, broke Bulgarian resistance, and by 1018, Bulgaria was fully incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. This victory extended imperial authority across the Balkans and solidified Basil's reputation as one of Byzantium's greatest warrior emperors. Under Basil III, the empire reached the height of its territorial expansion in the Middle Byzantine period. From the Danube in the north to the Euphrates in the east, Byzantine authority stretched across vast regions, and its prestige was acknowledged by foreign powers. Diplomacy with the Rus, Western Europe, and Islamic states reflected the empire's status as a major player in the medieval world. The Varangian Guard, composed of warriors from the Rus and later Scandinavia, became an elite unit in the Byzantine army, symbolizing the empire's ability to draw on international connections. The Macedonian era also solidified the empire's religious and cultural identity. The Orthodox Church, supported by emperors, became increasingly defined in contrast to the Latin West. Differences over theology, liturgy, and papal authority grew during this period, foreshadowing the schism that would come in the 11th century. Yet within the empire, the church and state worked in tandem, reinforcing the ideological foundation of imperial rule. Icons, once the subject of bitter controversy, now adorned churches and homes with renewed vigour, symbolising both devotion and the victory of orthodoxy. By the time of Basil Theska's death in 1025, the empire was at the height of its power, wealth, and cultural vitality. The centuries of contraction and crisis seemed to have been overcome, replaced by an age of resurgence. Yet the very successes of the Macedonian dynasty carried seeds of future challenges. The concentration of power in the emperor, the reliance on military conquest, and the growing tensions with both Western Europe and neighbouring peoples would all shape the centuries that followed. For the moment, however, Byzantium stood renewed, its armies triumphant, its culture flourishing, and its capital shining as the jewel of the medieval world, embodying both the resilience and the grandeur of the empire that had endured for so long. The Byzantine Empire projected power not only through its armies and conquests, but through the rituals and ceremonies that surrounded the emperor and his household. At the heart of Constantinople, within the walls of the Great Palace, life unfolded in a world of carefully choreographed pageantry where every gesture, every robe, every procession carried meaning. The imperial court was not simply a place of residence or administration. It was a stage on which authority was performed and legitimacy reinforced. The Byzantine conception of rulership relied as much on spectacle as on law or military might, and the rituals of the court bound together religion, politics, and culture in a seamless display of imperial grandeur. The emperor was more than a monarch. To his subjects he was the chosen ruler of God, the earthly reflection of divine authority, and the guardian of the Christian faith. His role required not only governance, but constant performance of majesty. Ceremonies were designed to convey this image with overwhelming clarity, ensuring that all who entered the palace or observed a procession were reminded of the emperor's unique position in the cosmic order. The palace itself, a sprawling complex of halls, chapels, and courtyards, was the theatre of this majesty. Foreign envoys who entered were confronted with dazzling sights, mechanical devices, and gilded halls meant to inspire awe. Accounts from travellers described golden lions that roared, jewelled trees that glittered, and thrones that rose into the air as if animated by divine power. These marvels were not mere amusements. They were instruments of authority, signalling that the emperor ruled by heavenly mandate. The daily life of the court was punctuated by ceremonies that blended Roman tradition, Christian liturgy, and Byzantine innovation. Audiences with the emperor were carefully staged. The ruler appeared surrounded by guards, ministers, and clergy, clad in robes of purple, the colour reserved for imperial use. Those admitted to his presence followed strict protocols, prostrations, kisses of the hand or foot, and acclamations shouted in unison. These acts reinforced hierarchy, reminding all present that the emperor stood above ordinary men an intermediary between heaven and earth. For foreign envoys, the experience was calculated to impress, ensuring that they left Constantinople convinced of the empire's power and divine favour. The calendar of the court was filled with rituals tied to both religious and political life. Easter, Christmas, and other great feasts were occasions for imperial processions to the Hagia Sophia, where the emperor joined patriarch and clergy in elaborate liturgies. The blending of imperial and ecclesiastical ceremony made clear that emperor and church stood together as guardians of orthodoxy. Military victories were celebrated with triumphal entries into the city, echoing the traditions of ancient Rome but infused with Christian symbolism. The emperor rode through the streets, greeted by crowds, while relics of saints were carried alongside captured banners and spoils of war. These events projected an image of divine favour resting upon the emperor's arms. The imperial household itself was an extension of this ceremonial order. Members of the family, including the empress, children and relatives, were woven into the fabric of ritual. The emperors often played a prominent role, participating in processions, hosting audiences, and patronising churches and monasteries. She embodied ideals of piety and virtue, serving as a model for women of the empire. In some cases, as with Irene or Theodora, the empress even exercised regency or direct rule, demonstrating that the imperial household could adapt when circumstances required. The upbringing of imperial children was also shaped by ceremony. Born in the Porphyra, the purple chamber of the palace, they were called porphyrogenitus, born in the purple, a designation that emphasized legitimacy and dynastic continuity. Their education was overseen by tutors who trained them in theology, rhetoric, law, and the arts of governance, preparing them to embody the ideals of the dynasty. Court officials formed a hierarchy of roles and titles that reflected the complexity of the palace world. Eunuchs, who often held positions of trust close to the emperor, managed access and communications. High-ranking ministers supervised finances, diplomacy, and the army. Ceremonial offices such as masters of ceremonies and keepers of imperial regalia ensured that rituals unfolded with precision. Titles and ranks were jealously guarded, with elaborate systems of precedence that dictated seating, dress, and privileges. Advancement at court required both skill and careful navigation of intrigue, as factions and rivals vied for influence. For many, proximity to the emperor offered immense opportunities, but it also carried dangers, for favour could shift suddenly, and exile or execution awaited those who fell from grace. The court rituals also extended to the reception of foreign envoys. The empire's position as a hub of diplomacy required constant engagement with powers near and far, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Franks, Armenians, and others. When ambassadors arrived, they were received with pageantry designed to impress. They entered gilded halls, saw the emperor enthroned amid splendour, and witnessed mechanical marvels that conveyed the impression of divine authority. Negotiations were conducted amid ceremony, ensuring that even in diplomacy, the emperor's majesty was never separated from his political dealings. The accounts of envoys, particularly those from the Rus and the West, often speak of the overwhelming magnificence of the court, describing Constantinople as the greatest city they had ever seen, and the emperor as a ruler unlike any other. The importance of ritual extended to the smallest details of court life. Banquets were staged with symbolic gestures, the seating of guests carefully arranged according to rank. Clothing was rich in meaning, with colours, patterns, and fabrics signalling status. Purple remained the exclusive prerogative of the emperor, while gold, silk, and jewelled adornments marked proximity to power. The distribution of gifts, whether coins, robes, or ceremonial objects, reinforced bonds of loyalty. Even silence and movement were regulated. Courtiers learned when to speak, when to bow, and when to remain still in the emperor's presence. These layers of protocol created an environment in which every action reflected hierarchy and reinforced authority. The spiritual dimension of court ritual was equally important. The emperor was seen not merely as a ruler, but as a participant in sacred mysteries. Coronations took place in the Hagia Sophia, where the patriarch placed the crown upon the emperor's head in a liturgy that mirrored divine anointing. The emperor took communion at the altar, symbolising his role as first among the faithful. Religious relics were incorporated into ceremonies, reminding participants of the empire's sacred mission. Even military campaigns were framed in spiritual terms, with blessings given before departure and thanksgiving offered upon return. The integration of liturgy and politics made the court an extension of the church, binding together temporal and spiritual authority. The complexity of ceremony served practical purposes as well. In a vast empire with diverse peoples and potential rivals, rituals projected unity and stability. They reminded subjects of the emperor's centrality, discouraged rebellion by emphasizing divine favour, and reinforced the hierarchy that sustained the state. For foreigners, they conveyed power without battle, ensuring that diplomacy often succeeded before armies were even mobilized. In an age when communication was slow and authority fragile, the visual and symbolic language of ceremony carried messages more forceful than words. Yet the grandeur of the court was not merely display, it was also theatre of politics. Intrigue simmered behind the curtains of ceremony. Emperors feared conspiracies, and palace plots were frequent. The rituals themselves sometimes concealed manoeuvrings for power. Ambitious generals, ministers, and members of the imperial family sought influence, and coups were often staged within the palace walls. The very magnificence of the court provided cover for rivalries that could erupt into deposition or assassination. Still, even when emperors fell, the rituals persisted, for they were greater than any individual, embodying the continuity of empire itself. The Byzantine court thus became one of the most distinctive features of the empire's identity. Its ceremonies were admired, imitated, and sometimes mocked by foreign observers, but they left an enduring impression. Western Europe, encountering Byzantine envoys and descriptions of court life, borrowed aspects of its ritual for their own monarchies. The splendour of Constantinople's court shaped medieval concepts of kingship, reinforcing the idea that rulers must project majesty through ceremony. The endurance of these traditions across centuries ensured that Byzantium remained a model of imperial spectacle until its final days. The rituals and ceremonies of the court, intertwined with the life of the imperial household, revealed the essence of Byzantine political culture. Authority was never only about law or arms, it was about spectacle, faith, and the constant reinforcement of hierarchy. The palace, with its golden halls and sacred chambers, embodied the empire's belief that the emperor stood at the centre of a cosmic order, ruling not only by force but by divine sanction displayed in every ritual act. As the empire continued through centuries of struggle, the court remained the stage upon which its identity was performed and sustained, ensuring that even in times of crisis the majesty of Byzantium endured. The Byzantine Empire endured for more than 1,000 years not only because of its fortifications, wealth or diplomacy, but also because of its ability to maintain an effective military system that adapted to changing circumstances. While the Roman legions of antiquity had been the foundation of imperial power, the Byzantine army developed structures and strategies that reflected the empire's transformed geography, its Christian identity, and the pressures of constant war on multiple frontiers. From the thematic system that provided a steady supply of troops to the tactical innovations that allowed smaller armies to resist larger enemies, the Byzantine military was a flexible institution. Its endurance owed much to the combination of organisation, strategy, and technological innovation, and among its most legendary weapons was the mysterious incendiary substance known as Greek fire, which became a symbol of Byzantine resilience at sea. The thematic system emerged during the reign of Heraclius in the early 7th century, when the empire faced near destruction from the Persians and the sudden expansion of Arab forces. The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt deprived Byzantium of manpower and resources, forcing a reorganisation of military structures. Instead of relying primarily on centrally paid professional armies, The empire began settling soldiers on land in the provinces, granting them plots to farm in exchange for hereditary military service. These districts, known as themes, became both administrative and military units, with generals overseeing defence, taxation and justice. The arrangement allowed the empire to maintain a standing force without the crushing expenses of earlier systems, while also tying soldiers' livelihoods directly to the defence of their land. The themes created a network of regional armies that could respond quickly to invasions. In Anatolia, the heartland of the empire after the loss of the eastern provinces, themes such as the Anatolikon, Armeniakon and Opsikion provided reliable troops. Soldiers raised within these themes were familiar with the terrain, motivated to defend their farms and families, and bound by local ties that reinforced loyalty. Over time, the thematic system became one of the most distinctive features of Byzantine military organisation, balancing central authority with regional autonomy. While the quality of troops varied, the system ensured a steady supply of men and helped the empire survive centuries of raids and wars. Strategy in the Byzantine army emphasised flexibility and prudence rather than reckless aggression. Manuals written by emperors and generals reveal a preference for cautious planning, the use of intelligence, and the avoidance of unnecessary risks. Campaigns often relied on ambushes, feigned retreats, and harassment of enemy supply lines rather than direct confrontation with large forces. The Byzantines excelled at using diplomacy, bribery, and alliances to weaken enemies before battle. Warfare was seen not as a matter of honour, but as a calculated effort to preserve the empire with minimal loss. When possible, treaties were preferred, and when war was unavoidable, strategy sought to exhaust the enemy rather than annihilate them. The army's composition was diverse. Alongside native thematic troops, the empire employed mercenaries from many lands: Armenians, Slavs, Rus, Turks, Normans, and others. The Varangian Guard, composed initially of warriors from the Rus and later from Scandinavia and England, became famous as a loyal corps of elite soldiers serving as the emperor's personal bodyguard. Their reputation for ferocity and reliability made them a symbol of imperial power. The use of foreign troops reflected both the empire's cosmopolitan nature and its practical reliance on outside manpower. Yet Byzantine commanders generally sought to balance mercenary forces with native troops to avoid overdependence. Fortifications complemented the army's strategy. Byzantium invested heavily in defensive works, recognizing that holding key strongpoints was often more effective than risking open battle. Constantinople itself, with its triple Theodosian walls, was the ultimate fortress, but provincial cities were also heavily fortified. Castles and watchtowers dotted frontiers, providing warning and slowing enemy advances. This defensive network allowed Byzantine armies to fight selectively, avoiding catastrophic defeats while wearing down invaders through attrition. The combination of fortified cities and mobile armies made the empire extraordinarily resilient, able to withstand sieges and raids that might have destroyed less prepared states. Naval power was another cornerstone of Byzantine strength. Control of the seas allowed the empire to defend its coasts, secure trade routes, and project power abroad. The Byzantine fleet, based in the harbours of Constantinople and other naval stations, was formidable not only because of its ships, but also because of its use of Greek fire. This incendiary weapon, first developed in the late 7th century, became one of the most feared tools of Byzantine warfare. Its exact composition was a closely guarded state secret, known only to a select group of officials and passed down within certain families. When projected from siphons mounted on ships, it produced jets of flaming liquid that clung to wood, sails, and flesh, burning even on water. Enemies facing Greek fire often panicked, for ordinary methods could not extinguish it. Buckets of water were useless, and the only hope was sand, vinegar, or quick escape. The psychological impact of Greek fire was as great as its physical destruction. Arab fleets that threatened Constantinople in the 7th and 8th centuries were repelled in large part due to its use. Chroniclers describe scenes of terror as enemy ships burst into flames, crews leaping into the sea only to find the water itself ablaze. The weapons secured Byzantine dominance of the seas for centuries, ensuring that the capital could withstand sieges by cutting off enemy supply lines. While later powers developed their own forms of incendiary weapons, none matched the mystique or effectiveness of Greek fire in Byzantine hands. Its secrecy became part of its power, as the inability of enemies to replicate it reinforced the aura of divine protection over the empire. Training and discipline were critical to the effectiveness of the Byzantine army. Manuals such as the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice in the late 6th century, and later works by Leo VI and Nikephoros Phokas, provided detailed instructions on formations, logistics, and tactics. These texts emphasize the importance of preparation, scouting, and adaptability. Soldiers were drilled in the use of cavalry charges, infantry formations, and combined arms tactics that integrated archers, lancers, and heavy infantry. The Byzantine military was not static but constantly evolving, learning from encounters with Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Turks. This adaptability allowed the empire to survive in a world where enemies constantly shifted. Religion also played a role in the army's identity. Soldiers marched under banners bearing the cross, relics accompanied campaigns, and victories were celebrated with thanksgiving in churches. The belief that the empire was under divine protection reinforced morale, and defeats were often interpreted as signs of God's displeasure requiring repentance. Military service thus carried both political and spiritual significance, binding soldiers not only to emperor and land but to the faith itself. This religious dimension gave the army a sense of sacred mission, particularly in wars against non-Christian foes. The administration of the army was a constant challenge. Supplying troops across vast distances required efficient taxation, transportation, and communication. Grain had to be collected, equipment manufactured, and horses bred and distributed. The state maintained factories for arms production, granaries for food storage, and road networks for movement. Logistics often determined the success or failure of campaigns, and Byzantine commanders devoted great attention to ensuring that supply lines were secure. Corruption, desertion, and shortages were persistent problems, but the administrative apparatus of the empire proved remarkably capable of sustaining military operations over centuries. Despite its strengths, the Byzantine army was not invincible. Defeats occurred, sometimes catastrophically, as at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, when the Seljuk Turks crushed imperial forces and opened Anatolia to Turkish settlement. Yet even after such disasters, the empire often found ways to recover. The resilience of its military institutions, the adaptability of its strategies, and the enduring strength of its fortifications allowed Byzantium to endure when other states collapsed. The army was both a symbol of imperial power and the practical instrument of survival, embodying the empire's capacity to adapt and persist. The combination of the thematic system, strategic caution, naval supremacy, and technological innovations such as Greek fire ensured that the Byzantine army remained one of the most effective military forces of the medieval world. It allowed a state that had lost vast territories to Arabs and Turks to endure for centuries, preserving its capital and identity long after Rome had fallen and Western Europe had fragmented. The Byzantine military, though smaller than the legions of old, proved that endurance and adaptability could be as decisive as sheer numbers. Its history reveals the intricate balance between innovation and tradition, prudence and daring, faith and pragmatism that characterized Byzantine survival. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgars was one of the most enduring and complex dynamics of the medieval Balkans. For centuries, the two peoples lived as neighbours, rivals, and occasionally allies, locked in a struggle that shaped the political, military, and cultural contours of southeastern Europe. The interaction between Byzantium and the Bulgars was not a simple story of conflict, nor merely one of diplomacy. It was a constant negotiation of power, marked by wars, treaties, conversions, and cultural exchange. Out of this interaction emerged transformations that reshaped both societies, leaving legacies that endured long after the fortunes of particular rulers had faded. The Bulgars first entered the Byzantine sphere in the late 7th century as a Turkic-speaking people who migrated into the Danubian plain. In 681, following successful campaigns against Byzantine armies, they established the First Bulgarian Empire, securing recognition from Constantinople through a treaty that acknowledged their autonomy. For the Byzantines, this was a humiliating concession, as they were forced to pay tribute to a people they considered barbarian. Yet the recognition also reflected pragmatic realism. The empire was weakened by earlier wars with Persia and the rapid expansion of Islam, and its resources were stretched thin. The rise of the Bulgars marked the beginning of a new power in the Balkans, one that Byzantium could neither ignore nor easily defeat. The Danube frontier became the primary zone of interaction. Byzantine emperors launched campaigns to subdue the Bulgars, but these often met with mixed results. The Bulgars, skilled horsemen and adept at using the terrain to their advantage, proved formidable opponents. They raided Thrace and Macedonia, threatening the approaches to Constantinople itself. At times, the empire was forced to negotiate peace and pay tribute, while at others, it sought to exploit divisions among Bulgar leaders to weaken their position. The relationship oscillated between hostility and fragile truces, with neither side able to achieve decisive dominance in the early centuries. The reign of Khan Krum in the early 9th century brought the conflict to a new intensity. Krum was a leader of remarkable energy, who consolidated Bulgar power and expanded his realm at Byzantium's expense. In 811, he dealt the empire one of its most devastating defeats at the Battle of Pliska, where Emperor Nikephoros II was killed in battle. According to chroniclers, Krum had Nikephoros' skull fashioned into a drinking cup, a gesture that symbolised both triumph and defiance. The loss shocked Constantinople, demonstrating the vulnerability of imperial power in the Balkans. Krum followed up with raids into Thrace and sieges of Constantinople, forcing the Byzantines into desperate defences. His reign marked the height of Bulgar military threat to the empire, one that left a lasting imprint on Byzantine memory. After Krum's death, the intensity of warfare eased somewhat, and diplomacy became more prominent. Byzantium recognised that outright conquest of the Bulgars was beyond its capacity, while the Bulgars recognised the benefits of coexistence with their wealthy neighbour. Treaties established periods of peace, trade flowed across the frontier, and cultural exchange began to take deeper root. Yet hostility never disappeared entirely, and wars continued intermittently, punctuated by uneasy truces. The turning point in Byzantine-Bulgar relations came in the 9th century, with the conversion of the Bulgars to Christianity. Khan Boris III, who ruled from 852 to 889, recognised both the political and cultural advantages of adopting the Christian faith. Surrounded by powerful neighbours, he saw Christianity as a way to unify his people, elevate his status, and secure recognition from both Byzantium and the wider Christian world. In 864, Boris accepted baptism from Byzantine clergy, taking the name Michael, in honour of Emperor Michael III, who stood as his godfather. This act marked a profound transformation, bringing Bulgaria into the orbit of Christian civilization. The conversion was not without resistance. Many Bulgar nobles opposed abandoning traditional beliefs, and Boris faced internal revolts, yet he persisted, suppressing opposition and establishing Christianity as the state religion. He built churches, encouraged missionary activity, and sought clergy to educate his people. The process tied Bulgaria to Byzantium, for the Byzantine Church provided priests, liturgy, and religious instruction. Yet Boris skillfully balanced his position, negotiating with the papacy in Rome as well as with Constantinople, seeking to ensure Bulgaria's ecclesiastical independence. Eventually Bulgaria secured its own archbishopric, while still drawing heavily on Byzantine models. The Christianization of Bulgaria was a turning point in Balkan history. It not only aligned the Bulgars with the cultural and spiritual traditions of Byzantium, but also opened the way for the spread of literacy, law, and art. The missions of Saints Cyril and Methodius, who developed the Glagolitic script to translate the Bible into the Slavic tongue, laid the foundation for a Slavic Christian culture that would endure across Eastern Europe. Their disciples, expelled from Moravia, found refuge in Bulgaria, where their work flourished. From Bulgaria, the Cyrillic script would later spread to Serbia, Russia, and beyond, making the Bulgarian conversion a moment of immense cultural significance, not only for Byzantium, but for the entire Orthodox world. The new Christian Bulgaria became both a partner and a rival of Byzantium. Cultural exchange deepened, with Byzantine art, architecture, and liturgy influencing Bulgarian society. Monasteries and churches rose, adorned with frescoes and icons modelled on Byzantine examples. Scholars and clergy travelled between the two realms, spreading learning and theology. Yet political and military rivalry persisted. Bulgaria sought to assert independence from Byzantine control, and conflicts continued over territory and influence. In the late 9th and early 10th centuries, under rulers such as Simeon the Great, Bulgaria reached the height of its power, challenging Byzantium directly. Simeon, educated in Constantinople and well-versed in Byzantine culture, nevertheless pursued imperial ambitions of his own, seeking to establish himself as emperor of the Bulgarians and even as a rival to the Byzantine emperor. Simeon's reign from 893 to 927 was marked by both cultural flourishing and intense warfare. He defeated Byzantine armies, raided deep into Thrace, and even threatened Constantinople. Diplomacy alternated with conflict, as Simeon sought recognition of his imperial title. Though Byzantium managed to contain his ambitions through a combination of military resistance and alliances with neighbouring powers, the rivalry reflected the complex dynamic between the two states. Bulgaria had absorbed much of Byzantine culture and faith, yet it remained determined to assert its independence and equality. The struggle with Bulgaria continued into the 11th century, culminating in the reign of Basil II, who devoted much of his rule to the subjugation of the Bulgars. After decades of campaigning, Basil achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Cladion in 1040, where he captured thousands of Bulgar soldiers. Chroniclers recount that he had them blinded and sent back to their ruler Samuel, who died shortly after from shock. This act earned Basil the epithet Bulgar Slayer, and symbolised the ruthless determination with which Byzantium sought to assert dominance. By 1018, Bulgaria was fully incorporated into the Byzantine Empire, its territories administered as new provinces. Yet even in defeat, the Bulgars left their mark. Their integration into Byzantium brought new populations, resources, and cultural influences into the empire. The memory of their resistance shaped Byzantine identity, reminding the empire of both its vulnerability and its capacity for triumph. In later centuries, Bulgaria would re-emerge as an independent power, continuing the cycle of rivalry and alliance. The interaction between Byzantium and the Bulgars was thus not a single episode, but a centuries-long relationship that transformed both societies. The wars, alliances, and cultural exchanges between Byzantium and Bulgaria illustrate the complexity of medieval politics in southeastern Europe. It was not merely a story of conquest or resistance, but of mutual influence, where enemies became partners in faith and rivals shared traditions even as they fought. The Byzantine Empire, through its encounters with the Bulgars, extended its cultural reach, while Bulgaria, through its adoption of Christianity and script, became a vital participant in the Orthodox world. The transformation that emerged from this relationship reshaped the Balkans, ensuring that the legacy of Byzantium would extend far beyond its own borders through the medium of Slavic Christianity. The relationship between Byzantium and the peoples of the Rus, those emerging from the forests and river networks of Eastern Europe, unfolded in a way that combined conflict, commerce, and cultural transformation. From the first encounters in the 9th century, when the Rus appeared as raiders on the Black Sea coast, to their eventual Christianization and alliance with Constantinople, the dynamic between the two worlds illustrates how Byzantium projected its influence far beyond its immediate borders. It was a story of foreign tribes who came first with violence, later with merchants, and eventually with embassies seeking baptism and marriage alliances. Out of these encounters, new connections were forged that carried Byzantine traditions deep into the lands of the Slavs and beyond, shaping the development of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The Rus were a people of mixed Scandinavian and Slavic origins, whose power grew from their control of river routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. From their settlements along the Dnieper, they launched expeditions that brought them into contact with Byzantium. The first recorded attack occurred in 860, when a Rus fleet sailed across the Black Sea and struck at Constantinople itself. The sudden appearance of long ships near the walls of the capital shocked the Byzantines, for it revealed the reach of northern raiders into the very heart of the empire. Chroniclers describe how the citizens fled to churches, praying for deliverance. According to tradition, the patriarch carried the veil of the Virgin Mary around the walls, and soon after the Rus withdrew, perhaps due to the return of the Byzantine fleet, or perhaps for reasons of their own. The raid left a deep impression, however, and signalled that a new force had entered the empire's orbit. Subsequent decades saw repeated encounters. Rus expeditions struck the coasts of the Black Sea and the cities of the Crimea, raiding and trading in equal measure. Their longships, swift and deadly, carried warriors who were formidable in battle. Yet the Rus were not only raiders, they also came as traders, bringing furs, wax, honey and slaves to exchange for Byzantine silks, wine and luxury goods. The empire, recognizing the value of this commerce, sought to regulate relations through treaties. Agreements reached in 907, 911, and 944 established terms for Rus merchants in Constantinople, specifying how many ships they could bring, where they could dock, and what privileges they would receive. These treaties, preserved in detail by chroniclers, reveal the careful balance Byzantium maintained, accommodating trade while restraining the threat of sudden violence. Diplomacy was conducted amid these exchanges. Rus envoys visited Constantinople, dazzled by the city's size, wealth and ceremonial grandeur. Byzantine rulers understood the power of spectacle and used court rituals to impress northern visitors. The Rus in turn sought recognition and access to trade, while also probing the empire's defences. Out of these contacts grew both rivalry and fascination. For the Rus, Constantinople represented the greatest city in the known world, a place of marvels and wealth. For the Byzantines, the Rus were both dangerous barbarians and potential allies who could be drawn into the orbit of Christian civilization. Conflict remained a constant theme. In 941, the Rus launched another major attack, sailing with a fleet of hundreds of ships into the Black Sea. They ravaged the coasts of Bithynia and threatened Constantinople itself. The Byzantines, however, deployed their secret weapon, Greek fire. Jets of flaming liquid poured onto the wooden ships, engulfing them in flames. Chroniclers describe scenes of terror as Rus warriors leapt into the sea, only to find the water itself burning. The defeat was devastating, and it reinforced Byzantine naval supremacy. The image of Rus longships consumed by fire became a warning that, however fierce northern warriors might be, Constantinople possessed weapons and defences beyond their reach. Despite defeats, the Rus remained persistent. In 944, another treaty was signed, reaffirming trade privileges and diplomatic ties. Over time, the balance shifted from raiding to commerce and diplomacy, though the threat of violence never disappeared entirely. The Rus leaders recognized that the wealth of Constantinople was more accessible through peaceful exchange than through futile attempts at conquest. The empire, for its part, saw value in cultivating ties with the Rus, both to secure its northern frontier and to access the resources of the forest lands. The most significant transformation came in the late 10th century, with the Christianization of the Rus under Prince Vladimir of Kiev. The process reflected both Byzantine diplomacy and Rus ambition. Vladimir sought to consolidate his rule over the diverse peoples of his realm and recognized the advantages of aligning with the great Christian empire to the south. Negotiations with Constantinople culminated in his baptism, traditionally dated to 988. According to accounts, he accepted baptism in the city of Cherson in Crimea, and his subsequent marriage to Anna, sister of Emperor Basil II, cemented the alliance. This union represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of Byzantium, for it brought the Rus into the fold of Orthodox Christianity and tied them symbolically to the imperial household. The conversion of Vladimir had far-reaching consequences. He ordered the destruction of pagan idols in Kiev and the baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. Byzantine clergy and artisans were sent north, bringing liturgy, architecture and iconography. Churches were built in the Byzantine style, and the liturgy was conducted in Slavonic, translated through the script developed by Cyril and Methodius and their disciples. The adoption of orthodoxy not only unified Vladimir's realm, but also bound the Rus culturally to Byzantium. Over time, Byzantine influence shaped the art, law and political ideology of Kievan Rus, ensuring that its rulers looked to Constantinople as the model of Christian kingship. The alliance also had military dimensions. Rus warriors were recruited into Byzantine service, most famously as the Varangian Guard. These formidable soldiers, known for their loyalty and ferocity, became the personal bodyguards of the emperor. Their presence in Constantinople symbolized the deepening ties between the two realms. Chronicles describe tall, axe-wielding warriors standing guard in the palace, a striking image of the integration of northern strength into the Byzantine court. For the Rus, service in Byzantium offered wealth, prestige, and experience, while for the empire, the Varangians provided a dependable core of soldiers unentangled in local politics. The relationship between Byzantium and the Rus was thus marked by constant evolution. What began as raids of terror along the Black Sea turned into regulated trade, formal treaties, and eventually spiritual and political alliance. The Rus were impressed by the magnificence of Constantinople, while Byzantium recognized the strategic importance of guiding them into the Christian fold. Out of their interactions emerged a Slavic Orthodox culture that carried Byzantine traditions deep into Eastern Europe. The domes of Kiev's churches, the icons of Rus artisans, and the liturgy of its priests all testified to the enduring influence of Constantinople. For Byzantium, the Rus were both a threat and an opportunity. Their warriors could devastate coastal towns, but their allegiance could also strengthen the empire's armies. Their fleets could menace the capital, but their baptism could extend Byzantine faith and culture into vast new lands. The empire's ability to turn raiders into allies and barbarians into Christian kings exemplified its diplomatic skill and cultural magnetism. The encounter with the Rus stands as one of the clearest examples of how Byzantium survived not only through arms but through the transformative power of its traditions. When the Crusades began at the end of the 11th century, Byzantium found itself drawn into a movement that was at once opportunity and danger, promise and betrayal. The empire, long accustomed to handling its enemies through diplomacy and carefully calibrated war, suddenly faced the arrival of vast armies from the Latin West, motivated by a religious zeal that Constantinople both welcomed and feared. What began as a call to defend Christian lands from Muslim control became a centuries-long entanglement that transformed the relationship between Byzantium and Western Europe. The Crusades brought moments of cooperation and victory, but also suspicion, rivalry, and ultimately catastrophe. The origins of Byzantine involvement with the Crusades lay in the reign of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. By the late 11th century, the empire had suffered a series of disasters. The defeat at Manzikert in 1071 had opened Anatolia to Turkish occupation, cutting away the empire's heartland. the Seljuk Turks established the Sultanate of Rum, and Byzantine authority in Asia Minor collapsed. Internal strife, fiscal weakness and military decline further undermined the state. When Alexios seized the throne in 1081, he inherited a precarious situation, with Norman invaders threatening from the west and Turks entrenched in the east. He sought to stabilise the empire by reorganising the army, reforming finances and appealing for aid from the west. In 1095, Alexios sent envoys to Pope Urban II, requesting mercenary forces to help recover lost territories. The Pope responded with something far greater than the emperor had anticipated. At the Council of Clermont, Urban called for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem and aid Eastern Christians, launching the First Crusade. Vast numbers of knights, peasants and adventurers from across Western Europe took up the cross, motivated by piety, ambition and the promise of spiritual rewards. Alexios had sought disciplined contingents of soldiers. What he received was a mass movement unlike anything Byzantium had seen before. The arrival of the First Crusade in Constantinople in 1096 presented Alexios with both opportunity and peril. The Crusaders were fierce warriors, but also unruly and suspicious of Byzantine intentions. Alexios, skilled in diplomacy, managed to secure oaths of fealty from many of their leaders, promising that lands recovered from the Turks would be returned to the empire. With Byzantine support, including naval transport and supplies, the Crusaders marched through Anatolia, capturing cities and defeating Turkish forces. Nicaea, the former Seljuk capital, was restored to Byzantine control, and much of western Anatolia was recovered. For Byzantium, this was a genuine restoration of power, achieved through the harnessing of Crusader strength. Yet suspicion lingered on both sides. The Latins distrusted Byzantine caution, interpreting it as cowardice or treachery, while the Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as dangerous barbarians whose zeal made them uncontrollable. When the Crusaders pressed beyond Byzantine interests and captured Antioch in 1098, tensions grew. The city, promised to Byzantium under the oaths sworn to Alexios, remained in Crusader hands, establishing the first Latin principality in the east. From the Byzantine perspective, this was a betrayal, undermining the agreements that had framed cooperation. From the Crusaders' perspective, they had won the city through their own blood and valour, and they refused to yield it. This clash of expectations foreshadowed future conflicts. The First Crusade ultimately succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Latin states in the Levant. For Byzantium, the results were mixed. The empire regained some territories in Asia Minor and secured partial relief from Turkish pressure, but it also faced the establishment of new Western powers in the east, independent of imperial authority and often hostile to Constantinople. The dream of restoring Byzantine control over the Holy Land was gone, replaced by uneasy coexistence with Latin Crusader states. In the decades that followed, relations between Byzantium and the Crusaders oscillated between alliance and enmity. Under John II Komnenos and Manuel III Komnenos, Byzantine emperors attempted to assert authority over the Crusader states, seeking recognition of imperial overlordship. Sometimes this succeeded in securing treaties, but often it provoked resentment. The Latins were proud and ambitious, unwilling to bow to an emperor they viewed as decadent or untrustworthy. The Byzantines, in turn, regarded the Crusaders as crude and dangerous, lacking the refinement and diplomacy that marked their own civilization. Cultural differences deepened mistrust. Latins saw Byzantines as duplicitous, while Byzantines viewed Latins as arrogant and violent. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, further strained relations. Western armies, led by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, marched through Byzantine territory, clashing with local populations and disregarding imperial authority. Manuel Thorn, though a skilled diplomat, found himself struggling to balance cooperation with containment. The crusade ultimately failed in the Levant, and the mutual recriminations deepened the rift. By the mid-12th century, hostility between Byzantium and the West was increasingly apparent, even as both sides still recognised moments of shared interest against Muslim powers. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, revealed the extent of this uneasy relationship. Frederick's massive German army marched through Byzantine lands in 1189, creating tension and suspicion. Manuel's successors struggled to manage these vast movements, and the memory of past betrayals poisoned trust. The Byzantine court sought alliances with Muslim rulers against the Crusaders when necessary, a pragmatic strategy that enraged Latin chroniclers. To the Byzantines, survival required flexibility. To the Crusaders, such policies looked like treason against the Christian cause. The turning point came with the Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202. Originally intended to strike at Egypt, the crusade became entangled in Venetian politics and Byzantine dynastic struggles. In 1203, the Crusaders diverted to Constantinople to support Alexios IV, son of a deposed emperor, in reclaiming the throne. The city was taken, but when Alexios IV proved unable to fulfill his promises of payment and support, the Crusaders turned against him. In 1204, Constantinople was stormed and sacked, in one of the most shocking episodes of medieval history. Churches were looted, relics stolen, and the city's treasures carried off to Venice and Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire was fragmented, replaced in Constantinople by the Latin Empire, while Byzantine successor states emerged in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. For Byzantium, the sack of 1204 was a catastrophe from which it never fully recovered. The empire's greatest city was desecrated, its population traumatized, and its authority shattered. The establishment of the Latin Empire represented the ultimate betrayal of what had once been a shared Christian cause. To many Byzantines, the Crusaders had revealed their true nature, not protectors of Christendom but enemies as dangerous as the Turks. The bitterness left by 1204 deepened the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, making reconciliation ever more difficult. Even after the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII, Palaiologos, the scars of the Fourth Crusade remained. The empire was weakened, its resources depleted, and its prestige diminished. Latin enclaves persisted in former Byzantine lands, and Venice, in particular, established commercial dominance in the Aegean. Byzantium, once the central power of the Christian East, found itself reduced, fragmented, and increasingly unable to resist either Western or Muslim rivals. The Crusades, therefore, transformed the Byzantine relationship with the West. What began as an appeal for aid turned into a century of uneasy cooperation, cultural encounter, and mutual suspicion. The Crusaders admired the wealth of Constantinople, but despised its diplomacy. The Byzantines valued Latin military strength, but feared their ambition. The gulf between the two widened until it culminated in open conquest. The Crusades left Byzantium both diminished and disillusioned, its hope of Western alliance replaced by the memory of betrayal and destruction. The late 11th century brought Byzantium to a point of profound crisis. The disaster at Manzikert in 1071 had shattered the empire's control over most of Anatolia. The treasury was drained, and military discipline had eroded. Internal rivalries weakened the state even further, with usurpers and ambitious generals competing for power at a moment when external threats pressed in from all sides. The empire seemed poised to collapse under the combined pressure of Turks in the east, Normans in the west, and Pechenegs and Cumans raiding across the Danube. Yet from this period of disintegration arose a dynasty that reshaped the empire, restored a measure of stability, and reinvigorated Byzantine society. This was the Komnenian era, named for the Komnenos family, whose leadership in the 12th century brought about a revival that extended the life of the empire for generations. The founder of this revival was Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the throne in 1081. Alexios was an experienced general, descended from a distinguished military family, and he understood both the weaknesses of the empire and the means by which it might be rescued. He inherited a state on the verge of collapse, with the Normans under Robert Guiscard threatening from Italy and Epirus, and the Seljuk Turks firmly entrenched in Anatolia. Alexios responded with energy and pragmatism. He reorganized the military, creating a system of pronoia grants, by which soldiers and officials were rewarded with the revenues of land in exchange for service. This system reinvigorated the army, tying the interests of military men directly to the defence of the state. At the same time, Alexios cultivated alliances with powerful aristocratic families, weaving them into the structures of governance to secure loyalty. The Komnenian court became a network of kinship, binding together factions that might otherwise have torn the empire apart. Alexios also sought to stabilize finances by reforming the currency. The debasement of coinage in previous decades had undermined confidence in imperial money, weakening trade and taxation. By issuing the hyperpiron, a new gold coin of consistent quality, Alexios restored stability to the monetary system. This reform not only improved revenues but also re-established Byzantine coinage as a respected standard in international commerce. Economic recovery followed, with trade routes reopening and Constantinople once again becoming a vibrant centre of exchange. Military revival was at the core of Alexios's policy. Against the Normans, he secured naval support from Venice, granting the Venetians commercial privileges in return for their fleets. This alliance helped repel Norman invasions and restored security in the west, though it also gave Venice a foothold in Byzantine markets that would later grow into dominance. Against the Pechenegs, Alexios organised campaigns that culminated in victory at Livonian in 1091, where the nomadic threat was decisively broken. Against the Seljuks, his appeals for aid to the west initiated the First Crusade, which, though not entirely under his control, contributed to the partial recovery of Anatolian territory. By the end of his reign, Alexios had transformed Byzantium from a state on the brink of dissolution into one capable of renewed assertion. The Komnenian system depended heavily on the personal authority of the emperor and his family. Alexios' successors, John II and Manuel I, built upon his foundations, extending the revival and projecting Byzantine influence across the Mediterranean. John II, who reigned from 1118 to 1143, was a ruler of remarkable piety and discipline. Unlike his more flamboyant father or his ambitious son, John was reserved, cautious, and deeply committed to steady governance. He devoted his reign to consolidating control, waging campaigns in Anatolia that pushed back the Turks and restored Byzantine fortresses. His rule was marked by stability, honesty, and dedication, earning him respect even from adversaries. Under John, the empire's frontiers were strengthened, and the sense of order that had been missing in the previous century was re-established. Manuel I, who reigned from 1143 to 1180, represented the height of Komnenian ambition. Charismatic, energetic, and cosmopolitan, he sought to position Byzantium as a leading power not only in the East, but also in the politics of Western Europe. He married into Western royal families, welcomed Latin knights into his service, and engaged actively in the affairs of Italy and the Crusader states. His reign was marked by bold campaigns, including wars against the Normans, Hungarians, and Turks, as well as diplomatic ventures that brought Byzantium into contact with the great courts of Europe. Manuel cultivated an image of imperial magnificence, hosting elaborate tournaments and ceremonies that rivaled Western chivalric traditions. Under him, Constantinople flourished as a cosmopolitan hub, where Greek, Latin, and Eastern cultures mingled. The military achievements of the Komnenoi, though sometimes uneven, reflected a restored capacity for projection of power. Byzantine armies campaigned successfully in Anatolia, Cilicia, and the Balkans, while the navy, though increasingly reliant on Venetian support, maintained control over key sea routes. The empire once again asserted influence over Antioch, Cyprus, and the Crusader states, though its relationship with the Latins remained fraught with suspicion. Manuel's reign in particular demonstrated both the opportunities and risks of engagement with the West. His openness to Latin influence earned him admiration in some quarters but resentment in others, and after his death, anti-Latin sentiment grew sharply. The Komnenian era was not only one of military and political restoration, but also of cultural and intellectual vitality. The court became a centre of learning, patronising scholars, theologians and artists. Works of history, philosophy and rhetoric flourished, often produced by members of the imperial family or their close associates. Art and architecture reflected both continuity with Byzantine tradition and openness to Western influences. Churches built during this period displayed intricate mosaics and frescoes, while manuscripts illuminated with care circulated among elites. The blending of aristocratic culture with intellectual life created an environment where refinement and learning were closely tied to the exercise of power. Economically, the empire benefited from revived stability. Agricultural production recovered in many regions, while trade expanded through ties with Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Constantinople's markets thrived, filled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond, spices from the east, furs from the north, silks and jewellery from Byzantine workshops. The empire's wealth supported military campaigns and courtly magnificence, reinforcing the impression of resurgence. Yet the privileges granted to Italian merchants also sowed seeds of dependence and tension, as Byzantine commerce became increasingly dominated by foreign traders. The social structure of the Komnenian period reflected the dominance of the aristocracy. Great families, bound to the emperor through kinship and patronage, held extensive estates and wielded significant influence. Their power was both a strength and a weakness. It provided a base of loyalty for the Komnenian dynasty, but also concentrated wealth and authority in ways that undermined broader social balance. The peasantry, tied to estates, bore the burden of military service and taxation, while urban populations benefited from the prosperity of Constantinople, but also resented foreign merchants' privileges. By the end of the 12th century, the Komnenian system began to falter. The death of Manuel I in 1180 left the empire in the hands of weaker rulers, while aristocratic rivalries resurfaced. Financial strains mounted, exacerbated by costly wars and the growing dominance of Italian merchants. Anti-Latin sentiment erupted in violence, further alienating potential allies. The stability and revival achieved under Alexios, John and Manuel gave way once more to internal fragmentation and external threats. Yet for nearly a century, the Komnenoi had restored Byzantium from the brink of collapse, projecting power and culture in a way that reminded both friend and foe that the Empire of Constantinople remained a central force in the medieval world. The Komnenian Restoration stands as one of the last great revivals of Byzantium, a period when skillful leadership, military reform and dynastic cohesion allowed the empire to recover from disaster. Though the achievements proved fragile, undermined by structural weaknesses and external pressures, the legacy of the Komnenoi demonstrated the capacity of Byzantium to adapt and endure. The empire, once thought near extinction, had reasserted itself as a formidable presence, even if the challenges of the future would once again test its resilience in ways no dynasty could fully contain. Life in the Byzantine Empire unfolded across a spectrum of splendour, hardship, ritual and routine, woven together in ways that reflected the complexity of a civilization standing at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. To outsiders, Byzantium was often imagined only in terms of its emperors, its palaces, and the magnificence of Constantinople. Yet beneath the ceremonial glitter lay a society of farmers, artisans, merchants, clergy and soldiers, each group bound by traditions and expectations that gave shape to daily existence. The empire was sustained not only by its rulers and armies, but by countless ordinary men and women whose labour, devotion, and customs made up the fabric of Byzantine life. At the centre of this society stood Constantinople, the capital and heart of the empire. With its strategic position on the Bosporus, it was one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the medieval world. Its population fluctuated across the centuries, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, making it among the largest cities of its age. The city's streets were crowded with markets, workshops, churches and public spaces, where merchants from distant lands mingled with local citizens. The hippodrome provided spectacles of chariot racing, drawing thousands to cheer for their favoured factions, while the Hagia Sophia offered awe-inspiring liturgy, filling the senses with incense, music and shimmering mosaics. Life in Constantinople was a constant interplay between grandeur and practical necessity, between imperial ceremony and the bustle of ordinary commerce. The city was divided into districts, each with its own character and population. Artisans clustered in particular quarters, producing textiles, metalwork and ceramics that supplied both local needs and international trade. Merchants operated in the bustling markets near the harbours, where goods arrived from across the Mediterranean, the Black Sea and beyond. Grain from the empire's provinces, spices from the east, furs from the Rus, and silk produced in imperial workshops all passed through the capital. The government regulated commerce, maintaining granaries, setting prices, and issuing coins that ensured the stability of exchange. The coinage of Byzantium, particularly the gold solidus and later the hyperpyron, was trusted across the known world, and its circulation facilitated trade that reached as far as Baghdad, Cairo, and Venice. Daily life in Constantinople was a blend of luxury and hardship. The wealthy lived in spacious houses with courtyards, gardens and mosaics, enjoying fine clothing, imported goods, and elaborate feasts. Their diets included bread, wine, meat, fish, fruits, and spices, reflecting the empire's access to diverse resources. Banquets were occasions of display, where delicacies were served on silver or even gold plates, and entertainment ranged from musicians to acrobats. The poor, by contrast, lived in crowded quarters, surviving on bread, vegetables, and occasional meat or fish. They laboured in workshops, on the docks, or in service to wealthier households. Street life was noisy and unpredictable, with vendors calling out their wares, beggars seeking alms, and preachers addressing crowds on matters of faith or morality. Disease, fire, and food shortages were constant threats, reminding even the inhabitants of the great capital of the fragility of urban life. Religion was central to daily existence. The rhythms of the year were marked by the cycle of feasts and fasts, with Easter standing as the greatest celebration. Saints' days, processions and pilgrimages punctuated the calendar, drawing people together in shared devotion. Icons adorned homes as well as churches, serving as objects of prayer and veneration. Monasteries dotted both city and countryside, offering places of retreat, education, and spiritual guidance. Monks and nuns lived under strict rules, devoting themselves to prayer, labour, and study. But monasteries also became centres of local economies, owning land, producing goods, and caring for the poor. The presence of holy men and women in society gave spiritual depth to daily life, offering both models of piety and intermediaries with the divine. Family was the cornerstone of Byzantine society. Marriage was a union regulated by both church and state, with elaborate ceremonies marking the transition. Families arranged marriages with attention to property, alliance, and social status, though affection and personal bonds were also valued. Women played vital roles in managing households, raising children, and in some cases participating in business or land management. While society was patriarchal, Byzantine women enjoyed certain legal protections and could inherit property, initiate divorce under defined conditions, and act as patrons of churches and charitable foundations. The empress herself served as a model of authority, combining piety with influence, and on occasion ruling as regent or sovereign in her own right. Education was prized among the elite, with schools in Constantinople and other cities teaching grammar, rhetoric, philosophy and theology. Literacy was not universal, but it was more widespread than in many medieval societies, particularly among clergy and officials. Classical texts were studied and copied, ensuring the preservation of ancient knowledge. At higher levels, scholars engaged with philosophy, law and science, building on both classical and Christian traditions. The University of Constantinople, established in the 9th century, became a centre of learning, training officials for the bureaucracy, as well as intellectuals who contributed to the empire's cultural life. Beyond the capital, the provinces of the empire sustained society through agriculture. The majority of Byzantines were peasants, cultivating fields of wheat, barley, vines and olives. Villages formed the backbone of rural life, with communal traditions and ties of kinship shaping existence. Peasants owed taxes and services to the state, and many were bound to estates controlled by aristocrats or monasteries. The thematic system tied military service to landholding, ensuring that rural life was deeply entwined with the defence of the empire. Despite hardships, rural communities preserved traditions, celebrated local festivals, and maintained a rhythm of life tied to the seasons and the church calendar. The empire's diversity added to the complexity of daily life. Byzantium encompassed Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Syrians, Jews, and many others, each with their own languages, customs, and faith traditions. While the Orthodox Church dominated, minority communities persisted, often tolerated but sometimes subject to restrictions. Jews lived in many cities, engaged in trade and crafts, while Muslims and other groups formed smaller communities, especially in contested border regions. This diversity gave Byzantium a cosmopolitan character, though it also created tensions that occasionally erupted into conflict. Entertainment and leisure were important aspects of society. The Hippodrome of Constantinople remained the most prominent venue, where chariot races attracted passionate crowds divided into the blue and green factions. These factions were more than sports clubs. They represented social identities, sometimes carrying political significance. Their rivalries could erupt into violence, as in the Nika riot of 532, but more often they provided an outlet for collective enthusiasm. Music, theatre and storytelling also enriched leisure, with performances drawing on both classical traditions and Christian themes. Festivals combined religious devotion with communal enjoyment, blending sacred and secular in ways characteristic of Byzantine culture. The legal system structured social relations, drawing on Roman traditions and later Byzantine codifications. Laws regulated marriage, inheritance, contracts, and property, ensuring a framework for stability. Courts operated at various levels, from local judges to imperial tribunals, and appeals could reach the emperor himself. Justice was often uneven, influenced by wealth and status, but the existence of codified law provided continuity and legitimacy. The emperor was regarded as the ultimate guardian of justice, responsible for maintaining order and protecting the weak. Byzantine society was also marked by sharp contrast between wealth and poverty, power and subordination. The aristocracy lived in luxury, commanding estates, patronising art, and engaging in court politics. Merchants and artisans formed a prosperous middle stratum benefiting from trade and urban life. Peasants and labourers bore the heaviest burdens, taxed to support the state, and vulnerable to famine, disease, and war. Yet even the poor participated in the empire's religious and cultural life, finding dignity in devotion and community. Charitable institutions, often supported by the church or aristocratic patrons, provided some relief, distributing food, caring for orphans, and tending to the sick. In all of this, the presence of the empire's institutions loomed large. The emperor and his court, the church and its hierarchy, the army and its officers, all shaped the framework of life. Yet within that framework, individuals carved out lives of devotion, labour, and aspiration. The splendour of Constantinople, the resilience of rural villages, the devotion of monasteries, and the rhythms of the church year all combined to create a society at once complex and coherent. Byzantium's endurance rested not only on emperors and generals, but on the countless acts of daily living that sustained its people through centuries of triumph and trial. The Byzantine Empire was not only a realm of armies, emperors and churches, but also a civilization sustained by ideas, learning, and the written word. Its intellectual life spanned theology, philosophy, literature, science, and education, weaving together the legacy of the ancient world with the demands of a Christian society. In Byzantium, scholarship was not confined to cloisters or schools, but was deeply bound to the fabric of governance, religion, and identity. To understand the empire's resilience and influence, one must consider the intellectual traditions that animated it, the thinkers who preserved and transformed knowledge, and the ways in which ideas shaped the course of Byzantine life. Theological thought stood at the centre of Byzantine intellectual culture. The empire saw itself as the guardian of Christian orthodoxy, responsible for maintaining the true faith against heresy and error. This mission meant that theological debate was not a matter of private speculation, but of public concern, with emperors, patriarchs, and ordinary believers deeply invested in questions of doctrine. Disputes over Christ's nature, the role of icons, or the relationship between divine grace and human will stirred passions across centuries, leading to councils, controversies, and sometimes violence. Yet these debates also produced a rich body of theological writing, where bishops, monks, and scholars articulated sophisticated arguments grounded in scripture, tradition, and philosophy. Figures such as John of Damascus, writing in the 8th century, defended the use of icons with arguments that blended theology with philosophy. His works became foundational in the eventual triumph of icon veneration. Later thinkers such as Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century, combined theological erudition with broad humanist learning, leaving behind works that reflected the depth of Byzantine scholarship. The hesychast controversy of the 14th century, centred on mystical prayer and the vision of divine light, produced writings by Gregory Palamas that continue to influence Orthodox theology today. In each era, theological debate was not confined to specialists but engaged the whole society, shaping identity and defining boundaries of orthodoxy. The preservation and study of classical literature was another hallmark of Byzantine intellectual life. From Homer to Plato, from Aristotle to Galen, ancient texts were copied, studied, and taught in Byzantine schools. While much of Western Europe lost direct access to Greek literature in the early medieval period, Byzantium maintained continuity, ensuring that classical heritage survived. Scholars compiled encyclopedias, commentaries, and lexicons that preserved fragments of works otherwise lost. Photius's Bibliotheca, for example, summarized hundreds of ancient texts, many of which no longer exist in full. This transmission of knowledge was one of Byzantium's most enduring legacies, shaping the later Renaissance when Greek learning flowed into Italy after the empire's fall. Education in Byzantium was structured but varied by class and context. Boys of wealthier families might begin with basic literacy, learning to read and write through biblical texts and simple works of grammar. They progressed to the study of Homer and other classical authors, mastering rhetoric, logic, and philosophy. Rhetoric held a central place in education, as it prepared students for roles in administration, law, and the church. Public speaking, persuasion, and elegant writing were valued skills, reflecting the continuity of Roman traditions in governance. For those pursuing higher studies, the University of Constantinople and other schools provided instruction in law, philosophy, medicine, and the sciences. Education was less available to the poor, though monasteries sometimes provided basic instruction, and women of the aristocracy could receive considerable learning, especially in literature and theology. Literary culture in Byzantium combined reverence for tradition with creative adaptation. historiography flourished, with chroniclers and historians recording the deeds of emperors, the progress of wars, and the unfolding of theological disputes. Writers such as Procopius in the 6th century, Anna Komnene in the 12th, and Michael Psellos in the 11th blended narrative with analysis, producing works that illuminate both political events and intellectual currents. Procopius, in particular, with his wars and his secret history, left a vivid and complex picture of Justinian's reign. Anna Komnene's Alexiad provided a perspective on her father's reign and the First Crusade, while also displaying her erudition and literary skill. These works reveal not only events but the self-consciousness of Byzantines as heirs of Rome and guardians of Christian truth. Poetry and hymnography were also central to Byzantine culture. Liturgical hymns, often composed by monks or clerics, filled the churches with theological reflection set to music. Romanos the melodist, a 6th century hymnographer, composed kontakia that remained celebrated in Orthodox worship. Poetic expression extended beyond liturgy into epigrams, occasional verses and learned compositions, reflecting both devotion and literary artistry. The blending of theology with aesthetics gave Byzantine hymnography a distinctive power, embedding intellectual reflection in the rhythm of worship. Philosophy retained an important role, though it was always framed within the context of Christian belief. Aristotle's logic and metaphysics were studied in detail, providing tools for theology and law. Plato's works, though less systematically studied, also influenced thought, particularly in mystical and theological contexts. Philosophical debates engage not only abstract questions but also practical issues of governance, ethics, and the nature of the soul. The balance between reason and revelation, inherited from the Church Fathers, remained central. Thinkers such as Psellos revived interest in Neoplatonism, while others sought to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. The result was a rich intellectual tradition that valued both rational inquiry and spiritual truth. The sciences were not neglected. Byzantine scholars studied medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy, often building upon classical and Hellenistic traditions. Medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates were copied, studied, and applied by Byzantine physicians, who served in both military and civilian contexts. Hospitals in Constantinople and other cities provided care, reflecting both medical knowledge and Christian charity. Astronomical texts guided calendrical calculations and navigation, while mathematical work supported architecture, engineering, and administration. Though not as experimental as later Western science, Byzantine scientific traditions preserved and transmitted knowledge, serving as a bridge between antiquity and later developments. Libraries and scriptoria played a crucial role in this intellectual life. Monasteries, churches, and the imperial court all maintained collections of books, copied by skilled scribes. Illuminated manuscripts combined textual preservation with artistic beauty, their margins adorned with intricate designs and miniature paintings. The labour of scribes ensured that texts survived across centuries, often through periods of war and upheaval. The imperial library in Constantinople, though suffering losses in fires and invasions, remained a repository of knowledge that connected past and present. Intellectual life was not limited to elites. Sermons, hagiographies, and popular religious texts circulated widely, shaping the understanding of ordinary believers. Stories of saints' lives, miracles, and martyrs provided models of piety and reinforced theological truths in accessible form. Preachers used rhetoric to reach broad audiences, blending moral exhortation with biblical interpretation. Through these means, intellectual currents reached beyond scholars and into the hearts of the faithful. The relationship between church and state also shaped intellectual life. Emperors often intervened in theological debates, convening councils and supporting particular doctrines. Theological disputes were thus inseparable from political power. Intellectuals who opposed imperial positions sometimes faced exile, censorship, or persecution. Yet their writings often endured, influencing later generations. The tension between authority and inquiry created a dynamic environment where ideas mattered deeply because they shaped not only faith, but the destiny of the empire. The intellectual world of Byzantium was thus a fusion of inheritance and innovation. The empire preserved the treasures of classical antiquity, transmitted them to the medieval world, and at the same time created its own body of thought in theology, philosophy and literature. It was a civilization where debates over doctrine could divide societies, where rhetoric and history shaped political life, and where manuscripts carried the weight of centuries. The continuity of learning, even amid crisis, helped sustain the empire's identity, linking generations across the long span of Byzantine history. Art and architecture in Byzantium were never mere decoration or engineering. They were expressions of belief, authority, and cultural identity. Every mosaic set in the apse of a church, every icon painted for prayer, every dome rising above a skyline carried meaning beyond the material. The empire saw itself as the earthly reflection of heaven, and its art and architecture sought to embody that vision. To step into a Byzantine church was to be transported into a space where the boundaries between the earthly and the divine seemed to dissolve, where walls shimmered with gold and light itself became a medium of revelation. The tradition began with the continuation of Roman building practices, yet it transformed them into something distinct. The basilica, inherited from Roman civic architecture, was adapted into a Christian form, providing long halls with apses where liturgy could unfold. Over time, however, the empire developed its own characteristic style, most famously the domed church. The culmination of this architectural evolution was the Hagia Sophia, built under Justinian in the 6th century, whose vast dome seemed to float upon a ring of light. Visitors who entered described the effect as overwhelming, as if heaven itself had descended upon earth. The Hagia Sophia became the model for countless churches throughout the empire and beyond, embodying the Byzantine ability to merge engineering with theology. Domes became a defining feature of Byzantine architecture. They were not merely structural solutions, but symbolic representations of the heavens. The central dome, often adorned with a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, placed the divine at the heart of the liturgical space, gazing down upon the congregation. Light streaming through windows enhanced the sense of transcendence, illuminating golden tesserae and reflecting off marble surfaces. The interplay of light and surface created an atmosphere of sacred brilliance, shaping the worshipper's experience. From Constantinople to Ravenna, from Thessaloniki to Kiev, the dome proclaimed the presence of God in stone and mosaic. Mosaics themselves were among the most distinctive achievements of Byzantine art. Composed of tiny pieces of coloured glass, stone or gold leaf set into plaster, mosaics adorned the walls, apses and domes of churches. Their brilliance came not only from their colours, but from their ability to catch and reflect light, producing a sense of living radiance. Subjects range from biblical scenes to portraits of Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints and emperors. The placement of images followed a theological logic. Christ enthroned in the dome, angels in the upper walls, saints and prophets below, and scenes of daily life or donor portraits at the lowest levels. This hierarchy mirrored the structure of heaven and earth, reinforcing the sense of liturgy as participation in cosmic order. Icons held a central place in Byzantine devotion. Painted on wood, often with tempera and gold leaf, icons were more than images. They were believed to mediate the presence of the holy. Believers venerated them with kisses, prayers and candles, treating them as windows into the divine realm. Icons accompanied individuals in their homes, soldiers in their campaigns, and emperors in their processions. The theology of icons, defended during the iconoclastic controversy, emphasized that the incarnation of Christ made visible representation legitimate, for God had taken human form. Icons thus affirmed both theology and piety, serving as bridges between the faithful and the divine. The production of icons followed conventions that emphasized continuity rather than innovation. Artists adhered to established models, preserving the sacred prototypes believed to trace back to the earlier centuries of Christianity. Yet within these conventions, there was room for subtle creativity. Variations in expression, composition, and detail reflected local traditions and individual skill. The icon painter was not seen as an innovator in the modern sense, but as a participant in a sacred tradition, reproducing images that carried timeless meaning. The result was an art form that achieved both unity and depth, recognizable across centuries yet capable of profound emotional impact. Architecture extended beyond great churches to monasteries, palaces, and fortifications. Monasteries became centers of both spirituality and art, often adorned with frescoes and icons that reflected the devotional life of their communities. Palaces, such as the Great Palace of Constantinople and later the Blachine Palace, displayed mosaics and marble that conveyed imperial grandeur. Fortifications, though primarily military, also embodied aesthetic considerations, with towers, gates, and walls designed to impress as well as to defend. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, stretching for miles and punctuated by massive towers, symbolize both practical defense and the majesty of the capital. Byzantine art was not confined to monumental works. Portable objects, such as ivory carvings, enamel work, and illuminated manuscripts, reflected the same combination of craftsmanship and symbolism. Ivories, often carved with religious scenes, were used in liturgical settings or as luxury items for the elite. Enamel panels, with their vivid colours and intricate designs, adorned reliquaries and crosses. Manuscripts copied by hand in monasteries and scriptoria were illuminated with miniature paintings that combined text and image into a unified expression of devotion and learning. These objects circulated within the empire and beyond, carrying Byzantine styles into Western Europe and the Islamic world. The influence of Byzantine art and architecture extended far beyond its borders. In the Slavic lands of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Rus, churches were built following Byzantine models, adorned with mosaics and frescoes in the same style. The domes of Kiev's churches and the icons of Russian workshops testify to the enduring legacy of Byzantine forms. In Italy, especially in Ravenna and Venice, mosaics reveal the direct imprint of Byzantine artisans. Venice, with its Church of San Marco, became a showcase of Byzantine-inspired architecture, its domes and mosaics echoing Constantinople. Even in the Islamic world, Byzantine influence can be traced, as early Muslim architecture drew upon the models of Byzantine builders and artisans. Art and architecture were also instruments of political expression. Emperors commissioned churches and mosaics to assert legitimacy, associating themselves with divine favour. Donor portraits in mosaics and frescoes depicted rulers alongside Christ or the Virgin, visually affirming their role as chosen by God. The Hagia Sophia itself was both a house of worship and a monument to Justinian's vision of empire. Later emperors continued this tradition, using artistic patronage to reinforce authority and project power. The blending of sacred and political imagery was characteristic of Byzantium, where empire and faith were inseparable. The materials and techniques of Byzantine art reflected both luxury and practicality. Gold leaf, precious stones, and imported marbles adorned the most important buildings, while local stone and simple frescoes sufficed for smaller churches. The use of spolia, reusing materials from older structures, was common, linking new buildings with the heritage of antiquity. Artisans developed remarkable skill in working with these materials, producing works that combined durability with beauty. Even ruins of Byzantine churches, stripped of their mosaics, convey the elegance of their proportions and the ingenuity of their construction. Art was also deeply personal. Icons in homes, crosses worn as jewellery, and small reliquaries carried by individuals made the sacred present in daily life. Pilgrims collected tokens from holy sites, carrying images of saints and relics as reminders of their journeys. The ubiquity of such objects reflects how art permeated every level of society, from the splendour of the Hagia Sophia to the humblest village chapel. In this way, Byzantine art was not confined to elites, but formed part of the spiritual experience of the entire population. The endurance of Byzantine artistic forms lay in their ability to convey stability and transcendence. While Western medieval art evolved through styles such as Romanesque and Gothic, Byzantine art remained remarkably consistent, adhering to conventions that emphasized timelessness. This continuity reflected the empire's self-understanding as the unbroken heir of Rome and guardian of Christian truth. Change occurred, but it was subtle, often in response to political or cultural shifts rather than radical innovation. The result was an art that seemed eternal, embodying the empire's claim to continuity in a changing world. To walk through a Byzantine church, to see the shimmer of mosaics in candlelight, or to gaze upon an icon was to encounter a world where art and faith were one. The empire's art and architecture were not mere achievements of aesthetics, but embodiments of its deepest convictions. They proclaimed that Byzantium was a sacred realm, where heaven and earth touched, where rulers governed under divine sanction, and where beauty itself was a path to truth. The legacy of this vision endures, for even after the empire's fall, its icons, mosaics, and domes continued to inspire and shape the religious and artistic traditions of vast regions. The Fourth Crusade was one of the most dramatic and devastating events in the long history of Byzantium, an episode that began with plans to strike at the Muslim powers of Egypt and the Levant, but instead ended in the conquest and plunder of Constantinople by fellow Christians. The catastrophe of 1204 reshaped the empire's destiny, shattering its political unity, devastating its capital, and embedding a legacy of bitterness between Eastern and Western Christendom. To understand the impact of this event, one must trace the combination of ambition, intrigue, and circumstance that transformed a campaign of supposed piety into one of conquest and ruin. By the end of the 12th century, Byzantium had already suffered serious decline. The stability achieved under the Komnenian dynasty was giving way to renewed internal weakness. The death of Manuel Afin Komnenos in 1180 left a fragile empire, governed by weaker rulers who failed to maintain the cohesion of the court and the loyalty of the aristocracy. Foreign threats multiplied, while resentment against Latin merchants in Constantinople grew into violence, culminating in the massacre of thousands of Italians in 1182. This act poisoned relations with Venice and other maritime powers, ensuring that when the next crusade was called, the seeds of hostility were already planted. The Fourth Crusade was proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1198, with the goal of striking at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power, as a way to secure Jerusalem. To transport the armies, the Crusaders made an agreement with Venice, whose shipbuilders promised to provide a massive fleet in exchange for payment. When fewer Crusaders arrived than expected, the Crusaders found themselves unable to pay the Venetians in full. The Venetians proposed an alternative. The Crusaders would assist Venice in recapturing the city of Zara, a rebellious port on the Dalmatian coast. The attack on Zara in 1202, though directed against a Christian city, marked the first diversion of the crusade, and it earned the Crusaders excommunication from the Pope. Yet the expedition pressed on, entangled now in politics far removed from its original purpose. At this moment, Byzantine dynastic struggles drew the Crusaders further astray. Alexios Angelos, the son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, appeared before the Crusader leaders, promising vast rewards and submission to papal authority if they would restore him and his father to the throne of Constantinople. The prospect of money, supplies, and the union of the churches appealed to many Crusaders and to the Venetians, who saw an opportunity to secure commercial dominance. Reluctantly, the army agreed to divert its course once again, this time against the greatest Christian city in the east. In 1203, the Crusaders arrived before Constantinople. The city's formidable walls presented a daunting obstacle, but internal divisions weakened the defence. The reigning emperor Alexios III fled as the Crusaders pressed their attack, and Isaac II was restored alongside his son, now crowned as Alexios IV. Yet the promises made by Alexios to his Latin allies proved impossible to fulfill. He had pledged enormous sums of money and supplies, but the treasury was exhausted, and the population of Constantinople resented the heavy taxes imposed to raise funds. Hostility toward the Latins erupted, with riots breaking out and churches set ablaze. The alliance between the Crusaders and their supposed Byzantine beneficiaries rapidly deteriorated. In January 1204, Alexios IV was overthrown by a palace coup, and a new emperor, Alexios V, refused to honour the agreements with the Crusaders. With their position untenable, the Latins resolved to take Constantinople by force. In April, they launched a full assault, breaching the sea walls with the help of Venetian ships and scaling towers. The city fell, and what followed was 3 days of pillage and destruction that shocked contemporaries and left scars for generations. Churches were desecrated, with relics stolen and sacred spaces defiled. The Hagia Sophia itself was plundered, its altars stripped of gold, its sacred objects carried off to Venice and Western Europe. Citizens were slaughtered or enslaved, and treasures accumulated over centuries of empire vanished in a frenzy of looting. Chroniclers, even among the Crusaders, recorded the horror with a mixture of shame and awe. The sack of Constantinople was not merely an episode of violence, it was a profound rupture in Byzantine history. The empire, long a unified polity centred on its capital, was shattered into fragments. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople, ruled by Baldwin of Flanders, while Venice secured control of key ports and islands, dominating commerce in the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantine elites fled, establishing successor states in Nicaea, Epirus and Trebizond, each claiming legitimacy as the continuation of the empire. The unity that had sustained Byzantium for centuries was broken, and its ability to resist external enemies was fatally weakened. For the Byzantines, the sack was experienced as humiliation deeper than defeat at the hands of Muslims. The Latins, fellow Christians, had become destroyers of the greatest Christian city, revealing not brotherhood, but enmity. The bitterness that followed hardened the schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism, making reconciliation nearly impossible. The memory of 1204 endured, colouring Byzantine views of the West long after the Latin Empire collapsed. For centuries, Orthodox Christians recalled the desecration of their holy places, the theft of relics, and the arrogance of Latin rulers. Even today, many relics and treasures in Western cathedrals trace their origins to that moment of plunder. Yet Byzantium did not vanish entirely. In Nicaea, a strong successor state emerged, preserving imperial institutions and orthodox traditions. Over the course of decades, the rulers of Nicaea gradually reconquered territory, culminating in the recovery of Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII, Palaiologos. But the empire that returned was no longer the same. The city had been stripped of wealth and population, its defences weakened, its prestige diminished. The Venetians and other Latin powers maintained enclaves that dominated trade, while the empire itself struggled with reduced resources. The sack of 1204 marked the end of Byzantium as a great Mediterranean power. Though it survived for 2 more centuries, it did so in a weakened and vulnerable state. The Fourth Crusade thus stands as a pivotal moment in medieval history, not only for Byzantium but for all of Christendom. It demonstrated the power of ambition, greed, and political intrigue to corrupt even a movement launched in the name of piety. It revealed the fragility of empires when divided within and betrayed without, and it transformed the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, opening the way for the eventual rise of new forces, both Latin and Ottoman. For Byzantium, it was a wound that never fully healed, a catastrophe that reshaped its destiny, and left a legacy of loss that reverberated until the empire's final fall. The recapture of Constantinople in 1261 by Michael VIII, Palaiologos, restored the Byzantine Empire's capital to imperial control, but the triumph masked a deeper reality. The empire that the Palaioloi inherited was not the Byzantium of old. It was reduced in size, weakened in resources, and surrounded by ambitious rivals. The scars of 1204 were visible in every corner of the city, walls in disrepair, churches looted, treasures dispersed, and population diminished. The restoration gave Byzantium a new lease on life, but the centuries that followed were marked less by revival than by struggle. The Palaiologan dynasty presided over a realm whose borders steadily contracted, even as its cultural and intellectual life retained vigour. Michael VIII was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, skilled in diplomacy and determined to reassert imperial authority. His restoration of the capital was achieved with a daring night assault that caught the Latin garrison off guard, returning Constantinople to Byzantine hands without massive destruction. Yet his position was precarious. To the west, Latin states and Venice still sought to regain their foothold. To the east, the rising power of the Turks in Anatolia threatened the empire's remaining provinces. Michael attempted to balance these dangers with diplomacy, at times making controversial decisions, such as negotiating church union with Rome at the Council of Lyons in 1274, in hopes of securing Western aid. The union, however, was deeply unpopular at home, seen as a betrayal of orthodox tradition, and it brought little practical benefit. His policies won Byzantium a measure of survival, but at the cost of internal discontent. Anatolia, once the heartland of Byzantine power, was slipping away. Turkish beyliks established themselves in former imperial territory, carving out small states that gradually expanded. By the early 14th century, one of these, led by Osman, gave birth to the Ottoman dynasty, which would grow into Byzantium's greatest adversary. The empire's resources were insufficient to reverse the tide. Successive emperors launched campaigns to hold the line, but each effort drained the treasury further, and victories proved temporary. The once mighty thematic armies had long since vanished, replaced by reliance on mercenaries whose loyalty was uncertain and whose cost was crushing. The Palaiologoi also faced constant entanglements in the Balkans. Serbian and Bulgarian powers pressed at the northern frontiers, while Latin principalities remained in Greece. In the 14th century, the Serbian ruler Stefan Dušan established an empire that briefly overshadowed Byzantium, seizing Macedonia and much of Greece, even proclaiming himself Emperor of the Romans. Byzantium, reduced to little more than Constantinople and its environs, survived only by playing rivals against one another, offering titles, marriages, and alliances to secure breathing space. The empire became a shadow of its former self, still bearing the name of Rome, but with authority shrinking to pockets of territory. Internally, the Palaiologan Empire was marked by strife and division. Civil wars erupted as factions within the dynasty vied for power. The most destructive of these broke out in the mid-14th century between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzénos, whose struggle drew in foreign mercenaries, including Turkish forces who seized the opportunity to entrench themselves in Europe. The empire's weakness was laid bare as its rulers invited outsiders into its heartlands, exchanging short-term advantage for long-term vulnerability. By the time the wars ended, the Ottomans had established a foothold in Thrace, crossing into Europe in 1354 and capturing Gallipoli, a moment that signalled a turning of the tide from which Byzantium could never recover. Economically, the empire struggled under the weight of decline. The privileges granted to Italian merchants in earlier centuries had left Byzantine trade dominated by Venice and Genoa. These powers controlled much of the commerce of the Aegean, reaping profits that once filled imperial coffers. Constantinople remained a market of significance, but its prosperity was diminished, its population reduced, and its grandeur faded. The countryside, ravaged by warfare and raiding, produced less surplus and the treasury was often empty. Emperors pawned relics, jewels, and even the crown treasures of the empire to secure funds, while the common people bore the burden of taxation and instability. Yet even amid decline, Byzantine culture flourished. The Paleologan period witnessed a remarkable artistic and intellectual renaissance, sometimes called the Paleologan Renaissance. Mosaics and frescoes reached new levels of refinement, with expressive figures and rich colour schemes adorning churches. The Kora Monastery in Constantinople, with its breathtaking mosaics of Christ, the Virgin, and biblical scenes, exemplifies this flowering of art. Literature and theology also thrived, with scholars such as Gregory Palamas shaping the mystical tradition of hesychasm, emphasizing inner prayer and the vision of divine light. Historians recorded the struggles of their age with vivid detail, providing some of the most poignant accounts of Byzantium's final centuries. The empire may have been shrinking, but its intellectual and artistic life remained vigorous, a testament to the resilience of its spirit. Diplomacy remained a constant necessity, though it often revealed the empire's weakness more than its strength. Emperors sent embassies to Western courts pleading for aid against the Turks. Appeals were made to the papacy, promising union of the churches in exchange for military assistance. Occasionally, crusading expeditions provided temporary relief, as when the Ottomans were defeated at Ankara in 1402 by the forces of Timur, giving Byzantium a brief reprieve. But such moments were rare and fleeting. More often, the empire found itself offering tribute to its enemies, acknowledging dependence in order to preserve a measure of survival. The last centuries of Byzantium were also marked by the growing dominance of the Ottomans. From their base in Anatolia, they expanded steadily, absorbing rival Turkish states and pressing deeper into Europe. By the reign of Sultan Murad Ros and later Bayezid Rum, the Ottomans had established themselves as the paramount power in the Balkans. Byzantine emperors, reduced to little more than city rulers, watched as their former provinces fell one by one. Thessaloniki, the empire's second city, changed hands multiple times, finally falling to the Ottomans in 1430. The Peloponnese, governed by Byzantine princes in the despotate of the Morea, remained a last bastion, but it too was vulnerable to attack. The emperors of the Paleologan dynasty carried themselves with dignity despite their reduced circumstances. Ceremonies in the Hagia Sophia continued, imperial titles were upheld, and the traditions of Roman rule endured in form if not in substance. The court still projected an image of majesty, even as its resources dwindled. Foreign visitors remarked on the contrast between the grandeur of Byzantine rituals and the poverty of the empire's actual power. The emperors maintained negotiations, dispatched envoys, and sought allies, but they presided over a realm that was inexorably contracting. The 15th century brought the final act of Byzantine history. John the Sap. Palaiologos travelled to the Council of Florence in 1439, agreeing to a union of the churches in hopes of securing Western aid against the Ottomans. The union was proclaimed, but it was deeply unpopular in Constantinople, where clergy and laity alike saw it as a betrayal of orthodoxy. Moreover, Western aid was minimal, for the Latin powers were divided and preoccupied with their own struggles. The hoped-for crusade never materialized in sufficient strength, leaving Byzantium exposed. The empire lingered on, maintaining its traditions and faith, but surrounded by an Ottoman power that grew ever more confident and determined. The Paleologan centuries reveal the paradox of Byzantium's final age. Politically and militarily, the empire withered, losing territory and influence until little remained. Yet culturally and spiritually it continued to shine, producing art, theology, and scholarship of enduring value. The shrinking borders could not extinguish the vitality of its traditions. Even as Constantinople approached its last days, its churches echoed with liturgy, its scholars debated theology, and its mosaics glittered with the radiance of faith. The empire that had once ruled vast territories now held little more than a city in its memory, but within that memory lay a legacy that would outlast its fall. In the middle of the 15th century, Constantinople stood as the last remnant of what had once been a vast empire stretching across continents. The walls that had withstood sieges for 1,000 years still rose proudly, their towers dominating the approaches to the city. Inside, churches continued their liturgies, markets still echoed with the calls of merchants, and the emperor presided over a court that preserved traditions of Roman majesty. Yet all who lived within those walls understood that the empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself, its surrounding lands reduced, its resources scarce, and its enemies formidable. The Ottomans, who had risen from a small Anatolian principality to a power that dominated both Asia Minor and the Balkans, now encircled the city on all sides. Constantinople, once the centre of the Mediterranean world, had become an island of defiance in a sea of Ottoman strength. The emperor in those final years was Constantine the Vizcins or Palaiologos, a ruler of courage and dignity who bore the heavy burden of defending what remained. He inherited not an empire in the traditional sense, but a beleaguered city with a dwindling population and few resources. Still, he upheld the traditions of his office, presiding over ceremonies, addressing his people, and negotiating tirelessly with Western powers for aid. Appeals went out to Rome, Venice, and the kingdoms of Europe, pleading for assistance in the face of the growing Ottoman threat. Some promises were made, and a handful of ships and soldiers would eventually come. But the days of great crusades were long gone, and Europe was divided by its own conflicts. The aid that did arrive was far too little to counter the storm that was gathering. The Ottoman Sultan at this time was Mehmed Effendi, a young and ambitious ruler determined to make his mark on history. To him, the conquest of Constantinople was both a strategic necessity and a symbolic goal. The city stood as the last obstacle to unifying Ottoman possessions in Europe and Asia, and its capture would provide a capital worthy of an expanding empire. Mehmed prepared carefully for the task, assembling not only a massive army but also the tools required to overcome the greatest walls in the medieval world. Among his most formidable weapons were giant cannons, cast by the engineer Orban, capable of hurling massive stone balls against the Theodosian walls. Siege artillery of this scale was unprecedented, and it signalled that the ancient defences of the city might finally be breached. In April 1453, Mehmed began his siege. An army numbering tens of thousands surrounded the city, while the Ottoman fleet blocked the Bosporus and the Golden Horn. Inside Constantinople, perhaps only 7,000 defenders stood ready, including Greek soldiers, volunteers, and a contingent of Genoese under Giovanni Giustiniani, a seasoned commander who took charge of the city's defences. The imbalance in numbers was overwhelming, yet the defenders relied on the strength of their walls and the resilience of their spirit. The Theodosian walls had turned back countless enemies before, and many hoped they would hold again. The siege unfolded with relentless pressure. Ottoman artillery battered the walls day after day, shaking the towers and collapsing sections of masonry. Repairs were made under cover of night, with defenders labouring to rebuild breaches as fast as they were opened. On the sea, Byzantine ships fought desperately to hold the chain that barred the entrance to the Golden Horn, and for a time they succeeded in keeping the Ottoman fleet at bay. But Mehmed's ingenuity proved decisive. He ordered ships dragged overland on greased logs to bypass the chain, bringing vessels into the Golden Horn from the landward side and trapping the defenders between two fronts. The morale of the city wavered as the scale of the challenge became clear. Throughout the siege, liturgies and processions filled the streets. Citizens gathered in the Hagia Sophia, carrying relics and icons, praying for deliverance. The emperor himself was seen among the people, encouraging them, reminding them of their duty, and participating in worship. The city, though weakened, was united in determination. Constantine X made clear that he would not abandon his post, rejecting offers to flee, insisting that he would share the fate of his people. His resolve became a rallying point, giving heart to defenders who knew the odds were against them. The assaults on the walls intensified as the siege wore on. Repeated attacks were repelled with arrows, stones, boiling oil, and counter-assaults. The defenders fought with ferocity, and for weeks they held out against overwhelming force. But the relentless bombardment gradually wore down the defences. On May 29th, 1453, Mehmed launched his final assault. Waves of soldiers stormed the walls, first irregulars, then elite janissaries. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was gravely wounded, and his withdrawal left a critical gap in leadership. Amid the chaos, Ottoman troops forced their way through a breach, and the defence collapsed. Inside the city, fighting turned to slaughter. The emperor, refusing to flee, is said to have cast aside his imperial insignia and fought as a common soldier until he fell in battle, his body never definitively identified. Constantinople was overwhelmed, its streets filled with soldiers and civilians alike caught in the fury of conquest. Churches were desecrated, including the Hagia Sophia, where crowds had gathered in prayer only to be interrupted by the invaders. The city that had stood for over a millennium as the bastion of Roman and Christian civilization was now in Ottoman hands. Mehmed entered the city as conqueror, riding to the Hagia Sophia, which he ordered converted into a mosque. His victory fulfilled both strategic ambition and symbolic destiny. Constantinople became the new Ottoman capital, renamed Istanbul, and its transformation marked the beginning of a new era. For Byzantium, the fall was final. No successor state remained to claim the imperial legacy. The last emperor died in defence of his city, and the empire of the Romans had come to an end. Yet even in its fall, Byzantium left a legacy that endured far beyond its political demise. Its traditions, scholarship and culture had already spread across Europe and the wider world. The flight of scholars to Italy, carrying manuscripts of ancient Greek authors, fueled the Renaissance, igniting a revival of classical learning that reshaped Western civilization. The Orthodox faith, rooted in Byzantine theology and liturgy, continued to flourish in Russia, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean, ensuring that the spiritual heritage of Constantinople lived on. The art of icons, the domes of churches, the chants of liturgy, all carried forward the imprint of Byzantium, shaping identities long after the city's fall. In the Islamic world, too, Byzantine influence remained. Ottoman architecture absorbed elements of Byzantine design, with domes and mosaics finding new life in mosques and palaces. The administrative practices and court rituals of Byzantium influenced their conquerors, blending into the evolving traditions of the Ottoman state. The memory of the city's grandeur continued to echo, with travellers and chroniclers describing its marvels long after 1453. The fall of Constantinople also reshaped the geopolitics of Europe. The loss of the great Christian bastion spurred new efforts to find routes eastward that bypassed Ottoman power, contributing to the age of exploration. Portugal and Spain launched voyages that would eventually connect Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In this way, the end of Byzantium indirectly opened the door to global transformation. For those who mourned the fall, the empire lived on in memory and liturgy. In Orthodox churches, prayers continued for the city of Constantinople, the lost queen of cities. Legends arose of the sleeping emperor destined one day to return and reclaim his throne. The empire that had once seen itself as eternal was gone, but its spirit remained alive in faith, culture, and imagination. Byzantium's endurance for more than 1,000 years had rested on its ability to adapt, to draw strength from its traditions while navigating the pressures of changing times. Its end, though tragic, did not erase the world it had created. The mosaics, the manuscripts, the theological writings, the legal codes, the chants of its liturgy, all continued to shape societies far beyond the Bosporus. The empire that had called itself Rome, that had stood between East and West, that had been a bridge of faith and culture, left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten.